Gregory Shushan is the world's leading authority on near-death experiences and the afterlife across cultures and throughout history. He's an award-winning author and a research fellow of the Parapsychological Foundation. He holds multiple degrees, including in religious studies and Egyptian Archeology. Gregory's latest book is called The Next World: Extraordinary Experiences of the Afterlife. As always, we've taken the time to create timestamps which can be found in the description below. So Gregory, to start us off, can you tell me a little bit about your background and about what you do now, please?
Sure, yeah. So I started in this near-death experience in historical and cross-cultural contexts when I was doing my BA at UCL, University College London, and I was studying Egyptian archaeology. And I started noticing that there were kind of parallels between the Egyptian afterlife in the earliest texts, like the coffin texts and pyramid texts, with near-death experiences. So just kind of general things like entering darkness and coming through light and deceased relatives and beings of light and that sort of thing. So I did my MA also at UCL, looking at Egyptian and ancient Indian Vedic afterlife beliefs in the context of near-death experiences. And then it just kind of snowballed from there. I did my PhD looking it's kind of those two civilizations, and then added ancient China and Mesoamerica and Mesopotamia. And then later on did a postdoc at Oxford, and that was looking at indigenous religions and near-death experience around the world. And then now I'm, strangely enough, I've just embarked on a second PhD at Newman University in Birmingham, and that's going to be on near-death experiences in classical antiquity. So that
cool.
That'll be a new book available in about 4 years. And in the meantime, I did I put together a book called The Next World, which was a kind of a introduction to basically my work in all these various areas, as well as looking at mediumship and reincarnation and descriptions of the afterlife and these other types of extraordinary phenomena.
Yeah. Wow. So many fascinating topics in there. I mean, your book as well, The Next World: Extraordinary Experiences of the Afterlife. I'll put the link in the description. And you've written two others. They're in indigenous. Tell me, they're indigenous or religion in indigenous.
Near-death experience in indigenous religions.
There you go.
Yeah, that one is actually going to be out in paperback this year. It's with Oxford University Press, so it was like $110. So now the paperback is going to be accessible to normal people. I think it's $24 or something like that. So and the first one was called Conceptions of the Afterlife in Early Civilizations, and I'm actually in the process of rewriting that and updating it, and that's going to be reprinted by Inner Traditions next year. So and actually it's going to be retitled Near-Death Experience in Ancient Civilizations. So
they're all such fascinating topics.
Thanks. Yeah, it'll be nice to get it all out there and available, so to the regular reading public, instead of just in academic libraries that 6 or 7 people read.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So I'm fascinated about all the Egyptian archaeology and everything like that. And were kind of the religious aspects a big part of that when you were studying it, or did you kind of get really intrigued by a small sub part of your degree at that point?
Yeah, I was always interested in the religious aspects and the esoteric side of things. And even though it was an archaeology course, I found myself more and more drawn to the texts. I kept kind of thinking, I actually want to know what these people believed and what they wrote and what they themselves expressed, rather than interpreting their burial formations or subsistence patterns or whatever. So I just kind of gradually shifted away from archaeology and looked at the different religious texts in Egypt and then around the world. So and for the same sort of reasons, I just felt like we can interpret different cultures in various ways by their material remains, but it was just fascinated me so much that we actually have writings by them and we can read what they said. And even if I can't read them all in the original language, I must confess, we could still, read the translations and try at least to get inside their heads and try to figure out what these texts were referring to and what they're all about.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. It is fascinating. I mean, just to think that there were people that lived thousands of years ago that, had similarities to us, right? Strong similarities
Right.
to modern humans, I suppose, in terms of how, again, there was obviously a lot different and the cultures were very different and things like that. But
Yeah.
it's really fascinating. It evokes something. I don't know really how to put words to it, but it's some kind of fascination, some childlike, the imagination and everything like that. It's just
Yeah.
gripping.
Yeah. And it's the kind of connection as a human that we think, those are, as you said, human beings who thought like us in some ways and felt like us and had similar experiences
Mm,
with, life and death and love and whatever else. But then often expressed in such completely
mm.
alien sorts of ways, and that's, so to me, like, it's the similarities and the differences that make it, particularly fascinating, and kind of
Yeah.
understanding both and how they interact.
Definitely, definitely. So before that, when you were at university and you kind of became really intrigued by the religious side of it and their beliefs, were you ever particularly interested in, like, had you come across near death experiences? Were you particularly interested in religion? Did you have any strongly held beliefs of your own at that point? Like, how did all these kind of topics, phenomena, whatever we want to call it, how did they first enter your life?
Um, when I was a kid, I used to read all kinds of books about, strange phenomena, and um, I had an aunt who was a Rosicrucian, and she'd give me books by Lobsang Rampa and books about witchcraft and things like that.
Mm,
Um, and my mom was sort of the hippie era, so she would take me to the Hare Krishna temple or to the Buddhist temple. And then my grandmother was Catholic, so we'd go to Catholic, things with her.
yeah.
My father was Jewish, so we'd occasionally go to like a cousin's bar mitzvah or something. So I was like basically born a comparative religion person.
Yeah.
And then with the kind of books about ghosts and strange phenomena layered on top of it, it's pretty I don't know, logical that things would have turned out how they have.
Yeah, yeah. And those books about ghosts and stuff, was that like from what age was that? And was that an interest, or was it something that you realized maybe should be taken seriously? Or what were your thoughts on that when you first came across it?
um, yeah, I was quite young, probably, I don't know, 10 or 11 or something, um, maybe even younger, but I was quite skeptical about it. There's one book in particular called Phenomena, and they had things like, um, in a coal mine somewhere in Wales or in, I don't know, South America. I can't remember. They would break open a large lump of coal and a live frog would be inside,
Oh wow.
supposedly from thousands of years ago. So just this, and then rains of frogs and fishes and rains of blood in medieval Europe. These just completely bizarre things. And I
Yeah.
think I read them with, you know, kids are pretty skeptical, I think, about a lot of things, and especially things that adults are saying. So, so I sort of read them through that way. So I think I even developed a kind of critical approach to this kind of thing at an early age, even though it was fascinating. And part of it's just
Yeah.
fascinating that people are claiming this and they're believing it. So what could possibly be behind it? You know?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Because you read about what people claim, but you also look at how that shaped and how that informed religions and beliefs of the time
Yeah,
of the different
exactly.
ages and cultures, which is obviously fascinating. Let's kind of, I guess, rewind and get onto NDEs and go back to what is the earliest NDE, the account of an NDE near death experience that you have researched, that you've come across. I think it's ancient China, 2,600 years ago, but correct me if I'm wrong, and either way, tell me a little bit about that case.
Yeah. Um, it's I guess it depends on how we define the earliest NDE, um, because there's in the people are probably familiar with the Epic of Gilgamesh from ancient Sumer, um, and in earlier texts, the earliest versions, he's called Bilgames, and there's a text where it's described that he dies and he's lying on his deathbed, and he goes to the other world, and there's a panel of nine judges, and they review his life, and these judges and deities are radiating light. So there's all these kind of near-death experience like um, descriptions, and he's on his
Yeah,
deathbed, and then he's sent back to his body in order to prepare his funeral. So, and it's also believed that he was actually an actual king, a historical king. So even though it's overtly a myth. It's very obviously a myth, and it's used in kind of to promote certain ideals and ideas of kingship and authority and things like that in ancient Mesopotamia. It's also could have been based on this actual historical king's near-death experience, which was then kind of elaborated and mythologized. And then even in Egypt, the god Osiris is the famous myth where he dies and comes back to life. And in the ancient texts, the deceased person, in these like guidebooks to the netherworld, they're associated with Osiris, and you're supposed to like emulate what Osiris went through on his afterlife journey and his resurrection. So, and a lot of, or at least some Egyptologists think that Osiris was probably a historical king, and the Egyptians themselves believed he was a historical king, sort of going back to early pre-dynastic times, and they name him on king lists and things like that. So, again, very obviously a myth, and it's used in ritual and religious texts. But who knows? It could have been, based on an actual NDE. But as far as historical ones that are in like a historical context, from the culture's point of view themselves, you're right. It's the Chinese one of the guy named Qian Si.
I was going to say with the Gilgamesh one as well, if it wasn't actually him that experienced it, it's probably a good chance somebody or some people had a very similar experience to that, and maybe it was written from that if it wasn't him. Or they would just add an incredible imagination to get something that then was going to be repeated in a very similar fashion thousands upon thousands of times throughout the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think at minimum it shows that people were aware of this kind of phenomena, and they knew what near-death experiences were, and they're constructing these narratives with that in mind, that this is part of popular knowledge. So but this NDE of Qian Si, it's interesting. It's there's two that are incorporated into the same text. One is from around 658 BC, the other one from around 500, and it describes how this Qian Si, who's like a regional ruler, he's some kind of local governor, and how he's sick, and he dies temporarily. Says that he goes to the Emperor of Heaven, and then he comes back and tells this story. And part of the story is that he encountered another person during his NDE who was also having an NDE. And the way they figured this out was that later in life, he's walking down the street in another town, and he happens to see this guy, and they look at each other like, they're very familiar to each other. And the guy says, basically describes his NDE and says, I was there. He turns out to have been a child who was standing there next to the Emperor of Heaven. So that's why the guy didn't quite recognize him, because he was just a child at the time. And the guy grown up says, this happened and this happened, and the Emperor of Heaven told you this, and he predicted this. So that was seen as a validation of the factuality of that experience, and validating that those kinds of experiences are real. And it was also used as a way of validating certain political and social predictions that were made during the NDE. So again, it was if it was based on an actual one, I'm not totally convinced that the prediction of this person will rule this region, or whatever the prediction was exactly, that the political element was genuinely the concern of the Emperor of Heaven. That's not what most near-death experiencers tell us, that they're going to come back and rule this region, and then they use that as justification. So
but if, like you say, if it's true that he bumped into him on the street, then that is fascinating. And if it's all true, then that would be, I guess, validation of the experience. I mean, again, it's hard to say with 100% certainty, but that would put the odds strongly in favor if that really happened. But obviously they do that's a phenomenon, isn't it? Shared near-death experiences. I mean, I know your work is based on the history of it, but it's something I've spoken to somebody that we both know, Bruce Grayson, and a few other people about that, and that is fascinating. People see somebody that they know in a near-death experience, or somebody that has passed but they didn't know had passed until, and they wake up and say, I saw this person, and oh yeah, they died while you were, in hospital or whatever.
Right. Yeah. And there are ancient and cross-cultural and indigenous examples of that kind of thing. And it's always used as, a way of demonstrating the reality of the experience, to basically say, this couldn't have happened unless I really was dead, because I saw a dead person who was there who I didn't even know was dead.
Yeah. Or like as well, like an old family member, like they're like, oh, I saw like uncle whatever, or auntie whatever, and then the parents are like, well, we never told you about that person. They died when like your father was a child or something like that, and there's been no pictures, and they come back and mention it. So is that quite common in the work that you've done, the research that you've done? Like, roughly how common would you say that is? Like the shared aspect.
Yeah, I would say ones where
it's hard to put words to it.
Yeah, I would say the ones where there's two living people, two near-death experiencers actually sharing the NDE and both coming back are much more rare than people seeing somebody that they didn't know had died, or who had died at the same time that they had. There are a couple examples of the first kind. There's one of a saint who was in a Roman prison in Carthage, Perpetua. She wasn't a saint yet at the time, and she was there imprisoned as a Christian martyr with a man named Sartorus, and they had a shared near death experience where they climbed a ladder to heaven and all this sort of thing. But as far as the ones of seeing people not known to have died, they're quite a bit more common, and they occur definitely cross-culturally. I wouldn't want to give any percentage to it, but I would say they're fairly rare, but they're pervasive around the world is probably the best way to put it.
Fairly rare, but consistently seem to happen occasionally.
Yeah, exactly.
Or something like that. Yeah. Well, fascinating.
They happen enough that it's they can't be dismissed, and the fact that they happen enough in all different cultures, this is quite a specific kind of phenomena, shows that there's something there to be looked at. Really, it's not easily dismissed, and it's definitely one of the elements in the the near-death experience scale of sub-experiences.
Yeah, which we're going to circle back to a bunch of this stuff later. Let me ask you, before we move on from there, I don't know why, but I have a little bit of a fascination with, like Native America and Native American whatever traditions and things like that. And I'm really interested to know kind of what maybe a classic Native American NDE would look like, or whether there's one in particular that you've got in mind. But if you could just speak for a couple of minutes about Native American NDE or NDEs.
Sure, yeah. Native American NDEs are really interesting because they're part of the purpose of the book, The Near-Death Experience in Indigenous Religions, was to look at the ways that near-death experiences were kind of culturally interpreted, as well as how they were culturally experienced, which we'll get back to that too. But so basically, with Native American cultures, by and large, they had this kind of vision quest and shamanic visionary experience tradition. So they were open to NDEs, and they were very accepting of them, pretty much. So I found something like 70 something examples of Native American NDEs going back from 16th century to the 1930s or 40s.
Wow.
And almost half of those, about half of them actually, said outright that their afterlife beliefs were based on the experiences of the person who died and came back to life, which is pretty impressive, because this idea that a whole culture's religious beliefs about the afterlife could be based on the narrative of one person who had an NDE is kind of it's a pretty profound thing, aside from the fact of whether they're true experiences or not.
Do you think that's because of the amount of kind of trust that they would have had within their cultures and within their groups, and they kind of wouldn't have had the same thing that we have in modern day society, where you have constantly we have a filter on, like, is this person lying to me? Are they giving me the genuine the truth and things like that? Whereas back then you just would have trusted these people, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's true. They had confidence in their own belief and in their own culture. And there's a really good example of that. There was, I I can't remember the people, somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, I think, but there were missionaries who came to them and they said, you need to convert to this religion because you're a bunch of demon worshipping heathens or whatever, and you're going to go to hell, and hell is eternal and it's filled with fire, and you're going to go there and burn, and you need to accept Jesus because Jesus says this and that. And this particular culture, this person who was talking to these missionaries said, we don't buy that because, for one thing, one of our own people went to the other world, and he came back and told us what it's like. If Jesus went there, that was like a couple thousand years ago, so why should we believe that? And what he said doesn't correspond to what our person said, so we're kind of doubtful of this. And then they also said, there's also not enough wood to keep those eternal flames going, so we don't buy that either. So really using kind of quite reasonable arguments, and arguments
Yeah.
based on their own experiences, which they were then to say, we're not going to accept those parts of religion, but they did accept Jesus as this great prophet, and they ended up, considering themselves Christians. They just didn't change their afterlife beliefs because of it.
Yeah. So did they didn't kind of allow for a hell? Is that right? They didn't, or is
No,
hell different in there?
no, they in the NDEs they didn't really. I can't think of any really distressing Native American NDEs actually. And they differ a
Mm.
lot by like there's a Zuni example where they see the person sees Kachina gods, which are those it's hard to describe what they are, but they're kind of wearing these masks and furs and things like that. And it's
Right.
very enculturated, and but at the same time, Zuni was one of the tribes who didn't have these kind of vision quest and shamanic visionary stuff. So they actually didn't, near death experiences were not part of their culture, but
Hmm.
nevertheless, there's somebody there who's having the experience. So they happen whether people believe in them or not, but they're still going to be culturally encoded, basically.
Yeah. Which NDE case or cases, it can be either, that you've kind of looked into, that you've researched, do you think stand out particularly for whatever reason? Which ones to you really kind of stand above the rest as like a very interesting example?
There's one, actually, just thinking of the Native American ones, there's one by a guy named a shaman who was part of the Kiowa people, and his name was Bianchi. And part of the reason it's interesting to me is because of this thing about how it influences local beliefs. So
Mm-hmm.
he undertook frequent visits to the spirit world because he was already a shaman, and he would go there to get knowledge and information for his people. And one particular example, he goes to the other world and reaches a spirit village, and he meets four women that he knew in his life on Earth, and they arrive on horseback, and there's a teepee village there as well, where his other previously deceased relatives live,
Yeah.
and they show him a ghost dance circle, which is the ghost dance was actually started by other Native American peoples who had NDEs, and they brought back this tradition where people could basically access the afterlife by this repetitive dancing, and use of drugs and things like that until they collapse, and then they're able
Yeah.
to go to the spirit world. So he sees that in the afterlife, like the spirit world ghost dance village, which makes me think, like, where do ghost dancers in the spirit village go if they're already
Yeah.
spirits? uh, but anyway, so he comes back to life, and there's a great picture. Maybe you can show it up on the screen, where he's showing a picture that he drew of the afterlife, and he's got a pointer, and he's pointing at this, teaching the villagers about what the afterlife is like, based entirely on his own experience. And in fact, it was
Wow.
used on the one of the drawings of his experience was used on the cover of my second book. So,
Yeah.
I mean, it's a bit obscure. We don't really know what's going on, but maybe this is like going towards the light in the darkness. These stars are maybe light, and then there's this
Okay.
Christian Jesus-y figure who's like radiating different kinds of light, and so it's
Yeah.
yeah, it's pretty interesting. So I find just the fact that he illustrated it and he used it as a teaching tool for his people about the afterlife is pretty amazing.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Are there any others that stand out to you? No pressure to they don't have to be. But I was just wondering before we move on if there was any others that you really wanted to mention.
Um, Not a Native American, but actually thinking about
No, from anywhere at all,
yeah,
anywhere, anytime.
just going back to when we were talking about the evidential stuff, and meeting people that you didn't know died. There's a really
Mm.
interesting Mormon one, by a guy named Walter Monson, or rather, that happened to a guy named Walter Monson. Just find that quickly. This was in 1923, and he was in a hospital in Utah for a abdominal operation, and he
Mm-hmm.
dies. And then he says, he awoke in another sphere of life, fully in possession of his faculties, and he meets his daughter, who had died 21 years before. She was now grown up, and he says,
Wow.
that she told him, "Go back, Papa. I want Richard first. Then Grandma must come, and then Mama is coming before you." Um, and so he comes back to life, and Richard is his son. A few weeks later, Richard dies, and then a few months later, his mother dies, and then his grandmother dies, and they all die in the exact same order that his daughter in the afterlife said that they would die. So,
Wow.
um,
Yeah.
and that's a pretty amazing example of an NDE. And in fact, in like Native Americans, strangely, Mormons are very open to NDEs because it shows that revelations are a continuous thing, and they didn't just end in the
Yeah.
biblical times. It kind of validates Joseph Smith's visions and things like that. So
Yeah.
so yeah, they're well into NDEs, and there are quite a lot of examples going back to the early Mormon times. You know, 8 or 10 NDEs at least until the 20s.
Cool.
Yeah.
Would you call that a precognitive NDE, or would it be? How would you describe that if you had to? Because obviously, like, they kind of have these revelations given to them, and then they seemingly come to fruition. They come to pass.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's probably a good description.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is a good time to talk about revelations and precognitions and NDEs that don't come true, or
Sure. Why not? Yeah. Let's balance it. Let's
yeah,
balance the force.
because there was a study by Kenneth Ring, in
Yeah.
the 80s. You know this one. Um,
I know of Kenneth Ring. I
oh,
don't
okay.
necessarily know this. What you're going to tell me?
Yeah, well, he started looking at the claims of people who had NDEs who had precognitive visions,
Hmm.
and they were saying things like, we saw this vision that the world is going to have some kind of massive upheaval, um, and there's going to be pain and suffering around the planet, and it's not going to be like the world's going to be blown to bits, but it's like a nuclear holocaust or an environmental catastrophe or something, and it's going to have global effects. Um,
Hmm.
and then it's going to we'll get through that, and eventually we'll enter this new golden age where everything on Earth is harmony and cooperation and brotherly love and all that. And this is going to happen sometime around 1988 to 1992. Um, and it was really consistent what people were saying, and strangely enough, the dates were really consistent. And then, without knowing it, there was a researcher in the UK, Margot Gray, and she found the exact same thing in the UK with people saying, you know, essentially duplicating everything, including the same dates between
Really?
88 and 92. So obviously none of that happened. And we're well beyond those dates now. I think that the most commonly stated date was 88. And so what do we do with that, with predictions that don't come true, which are, especially given the fact that so many people who had NDEs said they would have sworn that that's exactly what happened to them in their afterlife vision. So
Yeah.
so that's really intriguing to me as well, almost as intriguing as the stuff that's that seems like it's more evidential.
Yeah, I guess the same thing we kind of have to do with that is what we do with all the differences in the NDEs. I suppose it kind of adds a bit of complication to it. Like, obviously, if everything was the same, exactly the same,
Yeah.
and every prediction came true, it would be easy, wouldn't it? It would be like, okay, clearly this is, this is what happens, and this is
Yeah.
how things go, and there's no mystery here.
Right. Yeah.
But it just kind of, they throw spanners in the works, but they're necessary spanners. They seem to be in all these different facets of, relating to afterlife research and
Right.
and other elements like that. But yeah, it is bizarre. How do you deal with that? Like, do you have a theory on why some of them, I mean, it's easy to think of reasons why some of them might be true. And again, I'm sure we'll talk about that a bit more later, might come true. But what about why some of them just don't? Do you think it could be that they were not maybe the spiritual experience that they thought they were having? It was just a hallucination, or is there something else to it? Is it expectation, something worked in?
Yeah, I think I would agree with Kenneth Ring's assessment, actually. And this also ties into the Native American stuff, because he said, his theory was that these kinds of, millennial type apocalyptic ideas come about in times of cultural threat or fear, like kind of widespread fear throughout a culture. So if people are afraid of nuclear war, environmental catastrophe, or whatever, then that's going to come out in kind of these revelatory experiences, whether they're real or not. So it's kind of a culturally generated aspect of the NDE. And so I mentioned the ghost dance earlier. That was in direct response to the kind of cultural threat of the invading Europeans in the Native American lands. And there are quite a few of these. They call them religious revitalization movements. So there's the ghost dance and the Indian Shaker Church and the Dreamer religion. And all of them were in response to the invading Europeans. So they might have had genuine NDEs behind them, but a lot of times in the NDEs, they would say things like, you need to go back and revitalize the native culture, stop using European weapons, stop eating European food, stop drinking alcohol, and just get back to the purity of native culture. And then conversely, other ones would say, you need to go back to life and cooperate more with the Europeans because your survival depends on it, and you need to trade with them and stop fighting them and all this sort of thing. So it was all about this surviving the present difficulties in life and leading to what could then be a golden age and a revitalization of culture and reclaiming their resources and things like that.
Which we're still waiting for, hopefully soon.
Yeah.
Hopefully they were just like 30 years out, those ones that said 1990.
Yeah.
Although no, we don't really want the natural, the global catastrophe. That wouldn't be too much fun.
No.
And it reminded me, some of the NDEs in your book, they came back with like the message of, I have to stop eating fish or something like that. I have to stop eating meat and anything that was alive, or
right. Some of the
things
Buddhist
like that.
ones.
I think one of them was told he was just allowed to eat fish maybe, but he didn't eat any more fish either, and stuff like that. So what would you say? Would you say that was to do with something at the time? Do you think there could have been something happening in their culture at the time, or is that maybe more of a personal, like that person in particular was feeling bad about, like their diet, like eating animals and eating fish and meat and what have you?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I would probably say a bit of both, really. I mean, there's a Native American example where they say you need to go back and tell your people to stop wife beating. So you would think that anybody, well, you would hope that anybody who beats their spouse would have some kind of guilt on some level, So maybe
some
it took
voice, a conscience.
Yeah, so maybe that finally came out in the ND, and but then there's other more practical things like stop wasting funerary offerings, stop burning these offerings to the dead because they don't need it. Use them for yourself. So that was another interesting message that crops up a few times in some of the indigenous NDEs.
I guess that wasn't in one of the cultures where like they are treated differently in the afterlife based on their funerary offerings.
Right.
Or
yeah.
was it?
No, that would be
not anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what would you say are some of the most universal elements of NDEs, of near-death experiences that you've come across, like spanning cultures, beliefs through history? What would you say are some of the most universal, the similarities? And then we'll get onto the differences.
Sure, yeah. I would say in looking in the most thematic kind of terms is the best way to look at the similarities. So for example, going through darkness, which leads to another realm, the realm kind of radiating light, and then encountering a deity that, or some kind of spirit, non-human being that radiates light, meeting deceased relatives of some kind, or deceased, previously deceased friends or ancestors or whatever. And often being, this is maybe a little bit less common than those really general ones, but the being of light, or whatever spirit being it is, sending them back for whatever reason. But I would say just as often they just wake up in their body again. Another one that's quite common is not wanting to go back into the body, like seeing it as this kind of revolting thing that's a bit alien, and like, oh my God, that's
dirty
me.
jacket.
Yeah, this cold, horrible thing. And then the positive transformations after they return is almost universal, I would say. It's always it's culturally situated, like wife beating or whatever, but it's always some kind of positive message, pretty much.
Yeah. And these different elements, they go right back to the earliest ones that you've researched, and obviously they're still present now in modern day NDEs, like they're happening as we speak, pretty much.
Yeah.
So the deity aspect, that would, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but that would vary religion, like based on your religion, you would likely see the deity that you recognize in your religion.
Yeah.
And if you're not religious, I guess it's more likely to then be a being of light or love or something, just an entity
exactly
that has this kind of presence.
Yeah.
But normally, they categorize it within their own religion, their own culture.
Yeah. And that's difficult for a lot of people who have NDEs, because as they always say that it was more real than this reality, it was this like hyper real sort of place and experience. And they're totally convinced that they saw Jesus, and that was absolutely Jesus. So to then turn around and tell them, no, it was a universal divine being who you just impose Jesus on it because that's part of your culture. That's not going to work for people. So, and I don't know if that's even true anyway, but that's kind of the approach of near-death studies is, the being of light is like the objective thing for everybody, but it could be a different being for everyone, for all we know.
Yeah, we can't say for certain, but I guess a lot of people that have NDEs would either be atheist or agnostic going in, and then they come out and they're kind of more spiritual. They're kind of open to different things. You have people that go in as a Christian or a different religion, and they come out with their religion, strengthened, some of them. And then you have some, I would suppose, that go in with a strong religious faith and come out maybe, and they think they're still kind of spiritual and open to an afterlife and open to there being more to reality. But do some from your research, do some seem to kind of shed their faith or shed their kind of secular beliefs?
I would say in modern NDEs, there's probably more evidence of that. Some evangelical Christian maybe comes back and they're not quite as forceful in their beliefs, and maybe they see a bit more universality to the experience or whatever. But thinking about the historical and cross-cultural ones, it's really more interpreted within the religion, I think. Sometimes in order to prove that religion is correct, but I think it's also just a matter of that's just the worldview that it happened in, and so it's accepted within that worldview. And also just keeping in mind, like, they didn't, the whole concept of religion wasn't necessarily relevant to, like, a 5th century Buddhist or whatever. That's just, it's the Dharma, it's the life, is how things are. So it wasn't really like seen in terms of it wasn't, as far as like proselytizing goes and converting people to Buddhism, then they would be used in that sort of way. But in general, especially in small scale societies, I don't think there's any concern with like wanting to prove their religion correct or anything like that.
Yeah. And you mentioned the darkness and the kind of the light, I guess, as well, were kind of common elements. How has that come through? Because in modern day NDEs, I guess it's fairly common to be like a tunnel. You go through the dark tunnel and you come out into the light. It does even today in modern NDEs, and even if you probably localized it on one culture, it varies. It's not always the same. But what did that look like in your research? Is it all wildly different? Is tunnel maybe a recurring theme, even if not consistently with every NDE? Is it recurring through different cultures and beliefs? Or how did that come through?
Yeah, it's not universal, but it definitely recurs. There's a cool African example where the soul enters through a little knot in a tree, like a little hole where a tree knot
Wow,
was, and then goes down into the other world that way.
that's cool.
Yeah, um, yeah. There's all kinds of different forms of darkness that they enter. Um,
Yeah,
but what's really interesting about that actually is even that is not totally universal, because especially in Native American and Pacific cultures, they don't describe rushing through darkness at all, but they walk along a road. And
hmm,
so they'll even say, like, as they're walking along this road, they could see the footprints of the thousands of people who had gone to the other world before them. So that really can't be interpreted as rushing through darkness at all, because they can see the footprints and they're walking. So
yeah,
so the similarity there is the means of conveyance from the state of life to the other world. So which again that's a really interesting difference, because that part is similar, just the very general theme of going from this world to the other one. But why would some cultures rush through darkness and some cultures would just walk along a road?
yeah. I know, it's so fascinating. Like, why would it be different? If it's a real experience, why would it be so different? And again, it's similar but different. And so I suppose that brings me to a logical next question: is what are some of the main things that differ between NDEs, again, through history, through cultures, beliefs, and everything?
Yeah, that's one of the main ones. And the interesting thing about that, by the way, is we don't find in medieval European NDEs or Chinese NDEs or whatever walking along a road. It really seems specific to small scale indigenous societies. So
It's really interesting.
yeah, yeah. There were efforts to explain that in terms of like that they're pre-industrialized societies, so they wouldn't have experienced going through a tunnel in this life, so
Hmm.
that wouldn't be their sort of cultural metaphor. And that makes some sense, I think. But it doesn't explain why they're not at least going through darkness. And
Yeah. And they could have gone caving. They could have found some
yeah,
caves and, like, gone through just a natural tunnel.
right, yeah,
But yeah, it's really hard to kind of try and reason that and try and make sense of it, isn't it?
yeah. And they're also used to traveling at higher speeds on canoes or on horseback or whatever. So it's not
Yeah.
like they don't have the experience of speed. I mean, even running
Yeah.
can be. So, um,
Did they
so
ever see anybody else on the road? Sorry to interrupt you.
they
Did they
did,
ever
yeah,
see anybody else? Yeah. Okay.
yeah.
Very
And sometimes they
interesting.
would even see someone walking back in the opposite direction, and that person
No.
was obviously returning to the body from having an NDE in the other world. And then they would
Wow.
go back, and then that would be the meeting the person who that would be the evidential thing that they met the person who was also having an NDE at the same time they were.
Yeah. Yeah. That's wild.
Yeah.
That's really cool. What are some of the other main differences, would you say, with again, like, there are probably, maybe there are more things that are similar than overall elements that differ. What do you think?
Um,
If we were going to kind of drop them into buckets, like, these are the similarities, these are the differences. If we really broke it down to its most simple form, I know it's hard to do,
yeah,
but yeah, which side would be the heavier bucket?
I would say if you're looking at the similarities in the thematic broad way, then definitely more
Yeah.
similarities. But if you want specifics, then
Hmm.
more differences. So
Yeah.
another one is like the reason for being sent back to the body, the reason for
Okay. Yeah.
for the return. Um, we're used to hearing examples of people saying, I was told that I needed to finish something on earth. I needed to fulfill some ambition, or I had to go, I didn't want to leave my children behind, so I was sent back to care for them. It's always
Hmm.
some kind of developmental, benevolent, positive thing. Part of in fact, the positive transformation that the ND leads to. They come back a better person. Maybe they want to do charity work or whatever. Um, but in other cultures, in India and China and a couple of small scale societies, they're sent back because it was a case of mistaken identity. So
Oh yeah.
yeah, so they would say, we got the wrong, I would go to the afterlife and I'd be sitting there with the deity and his scribe or whatever, the officials, because there's a lot of bureaucracy in afterlife in a lot of these
Of
cultures.
course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they'd say, this is the wrong guy. What, looking at their minions and saying, go back and get the right guy. So so they would find the correct Gregory Shushan, and they would send me back to my body, and that's the reason for the return in different cultures. So again, being sent back, and just the whole idea of going to the other world and returning to your body and waking up, that's all obviously universal, because otherwise there wouldn't be any story to tell.
Yeah.
But the reason for being sent back is obviously cultural.
Yeah. That's fascinating. I mean, the ones where, yeah, the mistaken identity, I don't really know what to do with that. It
Yeah.
feels kind of, it's like if there is a place, if there is an afterlife, if assuming there is, you would think that the natural order of things, I don't know, obviously we're just totally speculating, but how it would work, you'd think there'd be something, it would work. You'd think it wouldn't be, like dealing with some company on Earth where like, oh yeah, sorry, we sent you the wrong thing. You wanted a medium, I sent you a small, or you wanted the green one, I sent you the blue. And then all of a sudden we have with Afterlife, like, oh yeah, they took the wrong Ben. Like, there's lots of Bens. It's an easy mistake to make.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you do with that? Do you? Because there's a kind of maybe an instinct reaction for me at least to kind of almost be more dismissive with an NDE like that, but do you look at them just as seriously as every other account that you come across, or how do you deal with the whole aspect of this mistaken identity? Because it's hard to take that seriously in a way.
Yeah. I do look at them as seriously, because I think just because we're used to a certain model of an NDE, which is
Mm.
probably rooted in our Christian influenced society going back however many thousands of years, hundreds of years. Um, and theirs is, coming from a different kind of culture. So I wouldn't want to say that, the Western model is more accurate, or a real reflection of what happens, and theirs isn't. Um,
No.
at the same time, I wouldn't really know how to explain it. I don't know if that means that, you know, whatever your beliefs are, that's what's going to manifest in your NDE. I mean, the way I tend to
Yeah.
think of it is, we influence them, but we don't create them. But that kind of example, or the premonitions examples that don't come true, those kind of make me think, well, are we creating them, and are we creating these experiences that aren't even real, or is it a
Yeah.
combination of hallucination and reality?
Yeah, I definitely think there must be an element of, like you say, like influence, at least from our own kind of self, or whether it's our brain, or whatever it is, our consciousness, who knows. But
Yeah.
I do think there's some kind of influence there, but the evidence seems to suggest there's a lot more to it than that. You were mentioned about some, I think you said this just a little bit earlier, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think you said that some religions don't really accept NDEs. Are there some religions that just refute it, just say like, oh, that's just not real, or that's like, yeah.
Yeah. Well, in contemporary science, if you want to see that as a religion,
Yeah.
and what I
Uh,
mean by that is like mainstream religiously skeptical scientists who just shut down any conversation of this kind, because
yeah.
of course there are scientists who, like, you mentioned Bruce Grayson or Sam Parnia or Pim van Lommel or Peter Fenwick, who are legitimate scientists, and they're open to the possibility of these things being real. So yeah, the kind of cult of skepticism denies them. But beyond that, there is the whole dynamic in indigenous African societies is really interesting, because I mentioned the way it was with Native Americans, and it was a complete opposite dynamic in a lot of the sub-Saharan African cultures. So, for example, rather than seeing somebody coming back to life as being part of this visionary shamanic complex where people just do that, certain people just come back to life and give this information. And in a lot of the African societies, they thought that person coming back to life was possessed by
Mm.
some kind of evil spirit, or that they had been reanimated without their soul by a
Mm.
sorcerer, so it was like a zombie.
Zombie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that they were going to wreak havoc on the community, and they just um, they didn't entertain the possibility that that was really that same person coming back. It was just the body had come back. So because of that, sometimes when this happened, they'd stone them to death, or they would drive them out of the village, or whatever. So examples of NDEs in sub-Saharan Africa are really rare because people didn't have a
Mm.
chance to even express them. Um,
Yeah.
and what's really interesting is this is reflected in their burial practices. So oftentimes, a lot of these societies would bind the hands and feet together before burial. So if the person did wake up, they're not going to get out, um, and stack stones on top of them. And there's one example of a woman who was a human sacrifice victim to the gods, and she, was bludgeoned on the head, and then she wakes up a little while later, and she said, "I went to the other world, and I saw the divine spirits and ancestors, and they said, how dare you appear to us naked? This is an offense. Go back and get dressed properly." And so she told her people that, and so they said, "Okay," and they dressed her and everything. And then she said, "Okay, I'm ready. Kill me again." And it was just like, there's no question of like that she was now going to be able to stay alive again. Um,
Yeah.
so there's a lot of these cultural dynamics that, on the one level, it's easy to judge and think, oh, wow, to think about our own um, relative or somebody who came back to life and stoning them to death instead of like rushing to their bedside and taking care of them. Um, but in a lot of these cultures, the whole attitude towards death was very different. It was just, for one thing, a lot more acceptant. So in certain ways, healthier, because if it was time for somebody to die and they knew it, they would just kind of go and wander off into the forest and lie there and wait. And a missionary or some kind of Western businessman or somebody would come by and say, all you need is some penicillin or whatever. Come back to my hut and we'll sort it out. And they just say, "No, it's my time. Just leave me alone." So
Yeah.
so it wasn't just like this. They're victimizing people. It was just kind of all embedded in the culture, really. And this
Yeah.
goes on to like even in more contemporary NDEs from Africa. There's some examples from the Congo, I think from mid 2000s or late 90s, where somebody came back to life. There's a study of various NDEs. And when they would come back to life, the people at the bedside would flee. Like instead of, being overwhelmed with joy at the person's return, they would get the hell out of there. So,
Yeah.
and ultimately now they're not stoning them to death because they're, it's a more modern societies over there. But it took some convincing for them to realize that this actually is the same person and not a reanimated corpse.
Yeah. That is fascinating. I just can't help but think about it from the point of view of whoever was in the afterlife greeting this person. They're like, "Oh, you have to go back," and the person's like, "Oh no, I want to stay here," and everybody always wants to stay here, but you have to go back, you have stuff to do. And they wake up back in their body only to get stoned to death, and the person in the afterlife has to greet them again, like, "What happened? I just sent you back." Like, don't send me back again. Just don't. Yeah, that's rough.
I mean, fortunately he sent her back because she was indecent, and so she expected to go back again. But yeah, and
Yeah.
that's again, if it were universal, if it were not culturally situated reasons, then that would make it a lot tougher.
Yeah. Yeah, again, that's definitely stands out as one of the things that is either cultural or individual, the thing where you have to be like dressed properly and everything like that.
Yeah.
Because that's certainly not something you hear often
No.
in contemporary NDEs and things like that.
Yeah.
I like to think if the afterlife is real, then it will be above above clothing choices
Right.
and what we wear and how we're dressed.
Yeah.
So those are a few examples of religions or cultures that kind of deny NDE or see it as something overtly negative. But what about like on the other side of it? I would suppose that lots of religions, maybe most, probably most, I would hazard a guess to say, kind of probably try to claim NDEs almost as proof of their own religion, and try to work it into their framework and say, "Oh, this this is, people go and they see, you know, our deity and everything fits to our religion, and so this is evidence of our religion. Is that something that is frequent? Am I right about that, or is it not so much?
Yeah, I think the two main examples I can think of that are contemporary Christian NDEs.
Yeah, that's actually kind of what I was thinking of a little bit.
Yeah, but then some
Yeah.
of the Buddhist ones I mentioned earlier, there's a real Japanese Buddhists mostly. There's a real kind of conversion motivation behind a lot of these texts, and they will often end with some kind of message like you need to go recite the Lotus Sutra 1,000 times or whatever it is, in order to ensure that you're going to have a better afterlife. And also, like, they have to go and do certain conversion activities or found a new temple or something like that. But I think again, that's a very cultural thing, because ancient Egyptian religion or ancient Indian religion or whatever, I don't think they had this evangelical conversion sort of drive. It was just kind of this is the way we are. It was not seen as a different religion. There was kind of no concept of religion. So
yeah. Would you say that there's any religion that maybe has more of a claim than the others? Not to, we don't want to start any wars here, but are there any that maybe it does seemingly align more with their code book, their I can't think of the right word, but however they are told they should live, or their beliefs, or what have you?
Yeah, I think Tibetan Buddhism probably has it pegged the most.
Yeah.
Because in Tibetan Book of the Dead, it even says things like that when you die, it will be colored by your culture and religion, and whoever, whatever deity you see, the being of light, which they even describe as a being of light, so they know that. Wow. They say it will conform to whatever your belief is and whatever deity you're going to basically project onto it. Wow. And they also talk about the different kinds of experiences and states that are pretty typical to NDEs. So yeah, I think that's probably the closest as far as having well, I would say explained in a way that I can accept and that makes sense to me, given the similarities and the differences. Because any religion that says it's Jesus, it's the Buddha, it's Muhammad, I just can't accept it because of what everybody else in all the other religions are telling us.
Yeah. What would you say to somebody that came to you and said that? Like, obviously you'd want to, assume it's somebody you want to be nice to and you don't want to upset them or anything like that. But if somebody comes to you and they say, Gregory, I had this amazing experience and it's proven to me that my faith is totally true, and you need to, whether they try and convince you to convert or not is another thing. But anyway, they come and tell you that this is all, aligned with my belief. And you, let's say, again, hypothetical situation, so you're not worried too much about upsetting them, but how would you handle this situation? What kind of thing would you say?
If they asked me, I would say,
yeah.
I'd say it seems to be one of two things. Well, if you want to believe that it was a genuine experience of a deity, it's one of two things. Either you really did see Jesus, and all the people of all the other religions really did see Muhammad and the Buddha and Krishna and whoever, or you're all seeing the same deity and you're just projecting your culture on top of it. I think I'd present it in that way rather than, because that's those are the two options that I think exist. I don't really I can't.
Yeah, you kind of nailed that. That was very short and sweet, but yeah, that was really good. That's exactly the way I guess that logic puts it, right? That is what it is. It seems like either everybody's right or everybody's kind of interpreting it in an individual way.
Right.
In terms of, well, we're kind of talking about religion a little bit still. Heaven and hell. Is that something? Because you obviously have experience with religion as well. You have a degree in religious studies, and I suppose it's something that has a lot of crossover with your research into the afterlife and NDEs. So yeah, how recurring is kind of the themes of heaven and hell and karma and judgment and these kind of vaguely similar ideas? How frequent is that? And are there any religions that don't have any aspect of karma and things like this?
Yeah, it's pretty common. I would say kind of almost universal, really. I can't think of any religion that has only a positive afterlife and no example of any negative afterlife. Well, except maybe some of the
Mhm.
indigenous religions, actually. Yeah, I would say a lot of them don't. But as far as, the major religions of
Yeah.
larger civilizations, um, they all do. But what's really interesting about that is they seem to accelerate and get more exaggerated and more uh, quite detailed descriptions of hells and torments and sufferings as time goes on within the civilization. And
Hmm.
and what I think that is a reflection of is that as access to religion and afterlife ideas becomes more widespread, more democratized throughout a society,
Yeah.
it's manipulated by the elite, by the church and the rulers, as a tool of controlling the masses. I mean, not to sound
Yeah.
too totally Marxist, but it's basically that. So for example, in the ancient Egyptian afterlife, in the earliest texts, the pyramid texts, there are descriptions of, you know, going passing certain perils, like apes who will cut off your head, and the snake that's spitting fire or whatever it is. Um, and then in the coffin texts, there are quite a lot more of these threats, and there's longer and longer descriptions of these kinds of threats. By the time you get to the New Kingdom with the Book of the Dead and whatever else they're called, the Duat and these other kinds of texts that are later in Egyptian history, and at that point, they're totally democratized. So anybody who has like can afford a little piece of papyrus has access to the afterlife. Whereas before they were just carved inside pyramids for practically the exclusive use of the king. So the
Yeah.
implication is that like the populace, the regular people, need all these threats of hell and promises of heaven, whereas the kings are pretty much beyond it. They just need to get past a few perils, and that's
Yeah.
repeated in China as well, in ancient China. By the time we get to those kind of later Chinese Buddhist texts, there's like this almost loving descriptions of um, you know people eating themselves and then exploding over and over and over. I mean, like these bizarre things that are physically impossible,
Yeah.
and having their heart carved out. It's this really really detailed graphic sort of thing, which just didn't exist in the earlier texts, which were more about transcendence and heaven and um, divine union with different deities and this sort of thing.
Yeah, once humans learn how they can use something to their advantage,
Exactly.
we're
Yeah.
pretty good at that. So yeah, so it's basically either be a really really good person or be really really rich, and then you'll be fine.
Yeah. Yeah. And I tend
So
to think that if there really is, well, I wouldn't even say if there's an afterlife, but the nature of a near-death experience, that's probably why there's so few negative examples of them, because that's the cultural overlay that people have. And even when there are negative examples, it's often that the person had a regular NDE, but they saw it or experienced it in negative terms. So
mm,
they'll go through darkness, but they'll think that the darkness is this oppressive, claustrophobic thing, and the being of light is this threatening, judgmental entity or whatever. So
yeah,
it's again
yeah,
overlay of your psychology on top of the NDE.
yeah. I thought that's really interesting. I heard. So, I think again, I always seem to reference Bruce when but Bruce, I think, mentioned something along those lines to me, and I can't remember which belief or culture or whatever it was, but maybe it was Buddhism or something like that, that you would kind of go in your ND to maybe like just space, just blackness, just darkness, as
Yeah.
far, just forever. And some people would feel then really kind of comfortable there, like, oh yeah, this is it. I can finally have time to think and meditate and be
Yeah.
myself. Whereas that would be terrifying for me, for example.
Right. Yeah.
That would be awful.
Yeah.
And it's those kind of little nuances, those little differences. And I think we will probably circle back to it later, but it's something that I've heard you mention somewhere else as well, is that again, in accounts that are very different of the afterlife, that's not to say that it's a different place they're describing, because it's the same. And again, I'm stealing from you here, but if two people visit London, somebody visits there from China and somebody, or even both from the same place, it can be just both from the same place to simplify it. They visit London and they both kind of do roughly the same things. They can have, like, one of them might say, I went to this restaurant, it was a bit shabby, the food was cold. The other person, oh yeah, we went to this restaurant, it was all right, the food was nice, at least it was warm, and like, at least my food was hot. And
Yeah.
and you can have two different experiences of the same place. And I felt that quite enlightening when I heard you say that about the afterlife, because it's always something I've struggled to kind of get my head around, is why are sometimes the accounts so different?
Yeah.
And it's obviously on a different level to experiencing something on Earth and saying, oh, it's having a different description of it, but it's a nice kind of, it's along the same lines. It's a nice way of looking at it.
Yeah, because none of us experience life on Earth in the same way. So why would be expected to experience life in some other realm outside of our bodies, without the constrictions of our brains? You know, why would that be similar?
Yeah, exactly.
Or the same.
Exactly. And I'm fascinated by all the religion stuff as well. That's something maybe I'll have to get you back on again in the future to talk. Maybe we can do it more detail about religion and different religions, because I find that really fascinating, like how that all started and how it's come to be what it is, and it's grown and it's snowballed, and like you said, it's been used by different people, but it's still here. It's still very present in our society in different manners. But for now, tell me, have you come across many accounts where people have woken up, and again, NDEs still for now, any accounts where people have woken up from like a coma, maybe a longer term coma or anything like that? And if there are any cases that jump to mind, I'd be interested to hear maybe something.
There are some historical cases where they say that the person was dead for, a ridiculously long amount of time, sometimes like years.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess you can have comas for years. I'm laughing, but that happens, right?
Yeah.
So
and I've always kind of seen them in terms of being a bit skeptical about them and thinking that it's probably an exaggeration. But it's true that they could be actual comas that they were in, and maybe they were perceived to be dead, because definitions of death will vary according to different societies. So but yeah, and then there's ones where they were dead. I would say the most common term of death is 3 or 4 days before somebody comes back, and I think that's because that's around the time the corpse would start to decompose, and it's unlikely that you're going to come back at that time.
Yeah.
But there are lots of examples, and these ones really make me skeptical. Lots of examples, especially in the Pacific for some reason, like in Hawaii, that the corpses had started to decompose and the person came back and reanimated it anyway. And I think that's just an exaggeration to show that the experience really happened, and just kind of to accentuate how miraculous it was that even a decomposing corpse was brought back to life, and that's proof that this was an amazing thing. But yeah, I don't think there's any clear difference though between the content of an NDE, looking at the historical and cross-cultural stuff anyway, whether they were said to have been in a long-term coma or just dead for a few days. Because I know I think it's one of the theories of contemporary NDEs is that if somebody is has like a sudden death, it's going to be different than if they died a long death as a result of cardiac arrest or whatever. So
have you noticed stuff like that in your research as well, or not so much?
No, not really. No. Well, I would say, like, as far as some of the 19th century stuff goes, and this just kind of corresponds to what other researchers have discovered, that experiences where people were not genuinely temporarily dead and they only thought they were going to die. So, and that's usually when they fall from a height, or they think that they're going to drown, but they didn't. Maybe they broke an arm, or maybe they got rescued or something, but they weren't really, really near death. And that usually is mostly a life review that they experience. So which I think is interesting, because it's your life flashing before your eyes as you think you're dying, but in actuality, the life review is pretty uncommon in near-death experiences across cultures. So it seems to be more associated with these fear-death experiences, as people call them.
which is fascinating because it does kind of, it shows that maybe it's not all biological and that there's something, it goes on just mentally when you realize, oh, I'm going to die now.
Yeah.
And something starts to happen before your breathing, gets affected, or your organs or your blood flow, whatever. Before your brain activity gets impaired,
Right.
Something happens.
Something's
Because
already
there's
happening.
accounts of
Yeah.
like climbers and stuff, aren't there, where they
Right.
kind of miss a step on a mountain and they're like rolling down the mountain, and yeah, they have, like you say, like a life review or another kind of profound experience.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting.
Yeah. And it's also interesting in the level of, you've probably seen these recent scientific paper where these how did it go? A guy, they were able to actually monitor, they had this guy hooked up to an EEG as he was dying. And so they were able to monitor brain activity during the death process, which apparently they hadn't done before, which was really surprising to me. But they determined that there's this huge burst of brain activity just after death, right at the moment when the person is declared dead. So, of course, the scientists come out and say, there's the evidence for near-death experience, and especially the life review. You've got this big burst of brain activity. It means your brain is flooded with all the memories that you had during your life, which, for one thing, is totally speculative because they don't know the subjective experience of that person at all. All they know is that there was some activity going on. But the other thing that I think is relevant to my work is that they're only looking at this kind of stereotypical model of the Western NDE that includes a life review. They didn't look at the fact that life reviews are actually really rare in other cultures and around the world, and historical NDEs. So, if the life review is a burst of brain activity at death, then why isn't everybody reporting a life review? So that just kind of shows one way that the cross-cultural differences can be used to kind of challenge some of the scientific materialist explanations.
Even in kind of the modern day and Western world, though, I think they're still kind of rare, aren't they? Life reviews. I think I may get this figure wrong. I think one of the kind of experts that I spoke to, one of the people that use, like, this is their job to research, or not entirely, but they main focuses of research. I think I've heard like about 10% of people or less experience like a life review.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me. So they're even rarer in the West than people realize. It just became this kind of popular notion of an NDE because it's interesting.
Yeah, it's one of the best known bits of it, isn't it? For sure.
But then again, there's kind of, again, thematic versions of a life review in different NDEs. So in there's an Egyptian text called The Teachings of Merikare, who was a king, and it describes how, and it's the same in the Gilgamesh text as well that I mentioned earlier, and they describe how the soul in the afterlife is read out the deeds that he had in life by these record keepers, and it's same in China too. Now that I think of it, but in the Gilgamesh one, in the Egyptian one specifically, it says his life plays before him as in an hour, his entire life, and as if it were being unfolded before him, which that does sound a lot like a kind of contemporary life review, actually, because it's all condensed into a short space of time, and it's kind of externalized, like as if he's watching it. So I found that's quite interesting.
Have you come across, again, often or not often, but have you come across the idea, because this is something I've heard of again in some Western NDEs and more recent ones, but it seems to be quite a recurring theme, is that during the life review, you go through all the things you've done. So if I, really upset somebody, I will then experience their upset at my own hands. In my life review, and so that would happen then for everybody that I've done something to, whether whatever it might be, whether I punched somebody or said something horrible or did something that affected them indirectly, I would then experience all that pain and suffering in my life review. So is that something that you've come across in like is it recurring, is it common, is it rare?
Yeah, I can't actually think of any real historical example of that.
Interesting.
There might be, but it's not coming to mind at the moment. So if they do exist, they're pretty rare for sure. It kind of I guess like empathetic life review.
Yeah. Because I think it is kind of, it sounds like quite cool. I think it sounds like
Yeah,
a nice way to show people that, you know, bad people, like how you've actually affected people. Because there's
yeah,
not many ways, at least on Earth, to get through to some people. Like some people have zero capability to empathize or anything like that. And so
yeah,
it would be quite nice if we knew something like that would happen afterwards. Like,
yeah.
everybody will be facing up to how they've made others feel.
In fact,
But yeah,
there's an
it's
example I can think of that's the opposite of that.
oh yeah.
There was a guy from the 20s named William Dudley Pelley, and he was an American Nazi, and he was like he promoted Hitler and legit Nazi, and
Yeah.
and he wrote an article for some mainstream popular magazine at the time, like Coronet or the American Magazine, one of these kinds of things, about his
Hmm.
NDE and his alleged NDE, and it's very typical of NDEs. And he said that left his body and met the being of light and whatever, and he came back to life, and then he later in his teachings used this NDE as a kind of to sanction some of his ideas about eugenics and um, and different kinds of Nazi type teachings. So
Yeah.
whether he had an NDE and it just had zero effect on him, or whether he just knew that people had these and looked at history and looked at examples of um, from Native Americans or whatever, of people starting religions based on NDEs and using that authority. Um,
Yeah.
and he just decided to make one up. Who knows? But it's an interesting.
Were there some elements to his experience that, at least, if not proving he actually had an NDE, proves that at least he researched the phenomena in order to make up his story? Like, was some of
Yeah,
it consistent?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. He clearly knew
Okay.
about the phenomenon for sure. Um,
Yeah.
which I
Yeah.
mean, even that, just in case any people don't know this, just like before 1975 and Raymond Moody, Moody named the phenomenon near death experience, and he's kind of
Yeah.
solely responsible, really, for having popularized it to the way it is today. Um, at that point, people were not even sure if they happened cross culturally or historically. He mentioned a few, um, but I think a lot of skeptics at the time were saying, why don't we have any examples of these in history? So
Mm.
now there's
I
hundreds
think
of
it's
examples.
still widely underknown, though. I think still not enough people realize how kind of universal it is and how it does span, like you say, history, cultures, beliefs, the works. Like, I still come across like people and hear people saying like, yeah, NDEs, but why do they mostly happen in, like our culture, or
Yeah,
why is it that it's only happening now? And obviously we're probably having more now in a sense. When I say that, I mean, like, there is way easier and more, we record them more. We live in a world now where we record a lot of things, and not as much as we should with NDEs. I think there probably should be some kind of procedure in place, like when somebody
yeah,
wakes up, they say, did you experience anything? Talk to this tape recorder or
yeah,
whatever.
for sure.
But we obviously record it more now than we used to. Plus, we're way better at bringing people back from the brink of death now.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Resuscitation
there's that too.
technology is much better than
Yeah.
in some indigenous culture in the.
Yeah. Do you expect that because of that, we're going to see more and more accounts of
Yeah,
NDEs
absolutely.
as we progress?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think
Yeah,
that
it's
stands to
interesting.
reason. Yeah.
So, from your research, how common would you say? I don't know if this is. I'm assuming you've come across some of these, but you'll have to tell me whether you have, and again, how common. But like end of life experiences, so things like terminal lucidity, and I guess it's a very broad kind of thing, end of life experiences. But I suppose it would include things like, in cases where somebody dies and the clocks all stop in their family member's house or in their best friend's house at the moment they died, or something,
Mm.
different. It can be anything, I guess, related to the death. But have
Yeah.
you come across many? Terminal lucidity is one that always fascinates me, where somebody's like, they don't really have their capacities anymore, and then suddenly before they die, they kind of sit up in bed and are able to communicate freely and like seem like they're healthy again, and it's kind of, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Those are amazing experiences. But I haven't run across many in the historical stuff. Partly just because I've been focused on the context of the death and return. So
Yeah.
and just kind of limiting things to that. But yeah, even having said that, I can't remember any examples of terminal lucidity. Lots of examples of deathbed visions, though, where
Hmm.
instead of the person going to the afterlife spirits come to him or her in the.
I think of that as an. I think of personally, I may be totally wrong, but I think of that as like an end of life experience because it reminds me of a couple of terminal lucidity things. Yeah, where people are lying down and then they sit up and they're talking to somebody
Yeah, yeah,
over there. Like they've got their family around, but they're referring to somebody else. Like, oh, I can't come right now. Just give me a bit. I'll be ready in an hour or so, whatever it might be.
right.
So you said you did come across some like that.
Yeah, quite a few like that. Yeah, the deathbed visions are pretty common. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. How common would you say compared to NDEs? Or it's hard to say because you've been looking for NDEs and coming across these as you go.
Yeah, yeah, that's
Yeah.
exactly it. But even given that, I would say probably just as common or close.
Uh,
Yeah,
okay, that's
and I
interesting.
wish, if could have gone back, I wish I'd noted down every time I saw them, but I didn't.
Yeah. Well, there'll be so many different aspects that you could have noted this down or that down. Because I was also going to ask you like how common, or again, just whether you came across many examples of after-death communications and or apparitions.
Um, yeah, apparitions more, but yeah, I guess no, I can't think of that many. Well, there's obviously like mediumship type traditions in different cultures, Native
Hmm.
American culture, and in parts of the Pacific, especially Melanesia. Um, so yeah, in that sense, there's definitely after
Yeah.
death communications, but in an
But not so
experimental
much
way.
like
No.
spontaneous. Yeah, not so much spontaneous. Just all of a sudden, there's an apparition of somebody that they knew that had passed, or
Yeah,
at least again, you're not looking for it actively,
yeah,
so it's
right.
hard to
I mean,
say.
there are some.
Mm.
There's a guy, Daniel Bork, who's doing a whole study on crisis apparitions, actually,
Oh, cool.
Bourke. Um, yeah, and he's uncovered loads and loads of them throughout history.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I'll try and check him out. Try and find him. And one more that I wanted to check with you. Like again, as you've been doing your research, has this come up? Intermission memories. In fact, I know this is something that's come up for you. But what would be the maybe universal elements of that, and how similar are they across cultures and history and beliefs? And for anybody that's not sure, intermission memories. I mean, you're probably better to explain it than me. But in brief, it's the memories when people wake up. When children remember past lives, they kind of sometimes remember the period before or in between, I guess is the best way to put it, like after their previous personality died and before they were reincarnated into the next body.
Right.
They remember being in some realm or some place, or it's described differently sometimes. There's one, obviously James Leininger, we've spoken about that before, that case.
Mm-hmm.
But it always kind of sticks in my mind that because I spoke to Bruce one day when they were sitting in their garden together, and James says like, "Oh, I knew you were going to be a great dad,"
Oh
and he's
wow.
like,
Yeah.
"So what? What do you mean?" He's like, I knew you were going to be a great dad as a great parents. That's why I picked you."
Yeah.
And he's like, "What?" And then James says like, "Oh no, Bruce, I think said, what do you mean you picked us? Where, like, how did?" And he says, "Well, I picked you when you were having dinner at the big pink hotel on the beach."
Right.
And Bruce, I think initially is like, "What?" Like, and then it all comes back to him, and they were there on their anniversary or something a few years before James was born. I can't remember the specifics, but
Yeah.
yeah, that was my kind of probably one of my first introductions to intermission memories and this kind of in between. So yeah, just speak for a little bit about that, if you don't mind. Just tell me what you've learned about that, what you've come across.
Yeah. They're an interesting phenomenon for sure. When I looked at them, I kind of used the near-death experience as like the baseline to compare them with, because I
Hmm.
wanted to figure out if it was basically the same experience. Because if the child is remembering the death of their previous personality and remembering what would have been a near-death experience if they had come back to life in that previous personality, um, it should be similar to an NDE if either or both of them, are veridical, or if it's the same type of phenomenon that's going on. So yeah, and there are quite a few examples. There's one from 19th century Japan, sort of mid 19th century, a little boy named Katsugoro who remembered, leaving his body, floating around the village. I think he tried to communicate with his parents and he wasn't able to. and then he saw his own funeral happening.
Mm.
Uh, he sat like on the shroud on top of the casket for a little while, and then he went, you know, up into the other realm, and he met some kind of deity who, you know, helped him to kind of choose his new parents, and
Wow.
yeah, and then he went to his new family, and this was quite a well researched case, especially for the time. There's a famous Japanese scholar who investigated and interviewed everybody, a kind of proto Ian Stevenson. And in fact,
Mm.
the case is one of those cases that inspired Ian Stevenson in his work. It's really interesting. It's going to be published, a new analysis along with some other new cases of Japanese reincarnation by a Japanese scholar named Okado Masayuki. It's called Katsugoro and Other Cases of Reincarnation in Japan, I think. So
Wow.
that's one interesting example. And then there's another famous one of Shanti Devi, who's the Indian girl who her case was also kind of reinvestigated by Stevenson, and it was one of the more evidential ones that he found. We just have a look at it because I'm not going to remember the content. It's really quite a complex one, and it shows a lot of the again how enculturated these experiences are, even if they have similarities in across cultures. So she was let's see, at the age of 4 she started talking about her past life memories, and it wasn't until the age of 10 that she started remembering her intermission memories, though. And she said,
Wow.
just before death I felt a profound darkness, and after death I saw a dazzling light. This is in 1936 when she's describing this, by the way. So absolutely no risk of, you know, contamination by having read Life After Life or anything. um,
Yeah, or watching too much YouTube or
yeah,
something.
yeah, exactly. She says, then and there I knew that I had come out of my body in a vaporous form, and that I was moving upwards. And then, so that could be a description of
Wow.
almost any NDE, but then it becomes super enculturated, where she says she was met by 4 teenage males who were wearing saffron robes, and they had a rectangular vessel that was 10 inches in diameter, into which they placed her soul, and then carried her soul inside this vessel to some other plane of existence. Um, and then they told her those who aspired to a higher life, um, but who had committed fleshly wrong in this life, were dipped into a river before moving higher. Um, and then they took her to a 4th place where everything was open space and full of light, soothing and enlightening. And then they met Krishna, and Krishna showed each person a record of their activities on earth, good or bad, which again is thematically related to the life review.
Yeah.
Um, and then also helped to kind of determine what their condition would be in their next life in the future. And she said she doesn't remember much about his words, but she did recall him saying house number 565, and that just happened to be the address of her new identity. So, so then
Wow.
these 4 saffron robed saints took her to a place that was like a staircase, and it was again very bright. She was taken to a dark room, and she says a very bad smell was coming out of it, which I think maybe was she went back to where her corpse was or something. I'm not
Hmm.
quite sure what that's about. But then she woke up in this new body, and she said she didn't feel any pain. And at the last moment, there was again a brilliantly bright light. So what I think is really interesting about these kinds of cases is they've convinced the evidentially, as far as like the reincarnation memories go, they've convinced some, you know, pretty rigorous scholars like Ian Stevenson and this 19th century Japanese scholar and various other people. They've been investigated in quite a lot of depth, and you know the only explanation for the things that these kids claim to remember is either they're completely lying and colluding with parents and other adults, and they've invented the whole thing for obscure reasons, um, or they're actual memories of an afterlife in some way or
Yeah.
another. So that combined with the fact that their intermission memories correspond so closely to NDEs, I think is a pretty amazing and compelling thing going on there.
Yeah, most definitely.
Yeah.
It is. They are incredible. These intermission memories are amazing. I just want to pick up on one thing you mentioned about that I couldn't remember if it was a little boy or a little girl, but sat on the coffin at their funeral,
Yeah,
or
little
sat
boy.
somewhere at their funeral. Yeah. Is that something that you've come across before? Like, or is that just a one-off, like in terms of intermission memories, or any way, but that would be the most common way I could think of it coming through. But somebody like attending their own funeral.
There are quite a few, yeah. I wouldn't say
Yeah.
it's really common, but yeah, or if not attending their funeral, seeing preparations for the funeral, like their corpse being, um, you know, people grieving over their corpse in their family home or whatever. Um,
Mm.
and there are some sort of extended out of body experiences where there's a Native American one where the guy leaves his body on the battlefield and he's kind of floating around and he sees it sitting there, and then he travels to his village and he tries to get people's attention, just like the way Kasugoro did. This crops up a lot, that people are confused that no one's interacting with them, that they can't see them or
Mm.
hear them, and that's one of the things that makes them realize that they're actually dead, and kind of
Yeah.
then they're able to take the next step and kind of go to the other world or whatever once they realize that.
Yeah, well, it's like at the start of Ghost, isn't it? When he's Patrick Swayze just
Oh,
died and
right.
he's sitting in the hospital and he's like having that process where he's realized like nobody sees me and everything like this.
Yeah.
I was just recently rewatched it. That's why that popped into my mind. Um, so tell me, you've also studied and researched quite a bit about children with past life memories, like we've just been discussing, like these reincarnation cases. So tell me a little bit about your research in this area, in that area.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
really just
just
been with the intermission memories. Actually, I haven't
okay.
investigated cases for their veridicality and all that. I think people
Hmm.
like Jim Tucker and the Japanese guy you mentioned, Okado Masayuki, I think they're much more equipped to to do that kind of thing. Um,
Yeah.
I mean, like for example, in one of Okado's cases, there was is kind of similar to the James Leninger case. Actually, it was a little boy who remembered being sunk on a Japanese battleship during World War II,
Mm.
and he had a
Oh
kind
yeah.
of mysterious dislike for Americans, even though he'd had no contact with Americans. I know that's an easy thing to have anyway for a lot of people. um, but he had all these very specific memories about the ship being bombed on a particular side repeatedly, and how it started listing at a certain degree. I mean, really quite specific stuff. Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, so there are cases like that I think are quite compelling.
How universal are the intermission memories though? Like you said, have you looked into it in quite some depth? Like do they happen across all of the cultures that you've looked at, all of the beliefs, all through history, or is there any belief or religion or whatever that they just don't seem to occur in, or anything like that?
Yeah, there's they're not that common. They're common within cultures that believe in reincarnation and report
Hmm.
these kind of experiences. So there's a few Native American examples. The Tlingit Native Americans have a few. Um, but yeah, where they do occur, they're if you were to take out the intermission memory context and the reincarnation context and just read it as a description, um, it could very easily be read as an NDE. That's how
Mm.
similar they are.
Yeah. Wow. Um, okay, and earlier we talked a bit about religions and how they kind of, some of them would kind of claim NDEs as evidence for their own belief system, and some of them would push it away and totally dismiss it, and even worse, like find it as a negative thing. But in terms of reincarnation, have you, again, it might not be something that you've kind of looked into too much, but are you aware of how different religions respond to that? Because I know that for some religions, I guess I'm thinking Christianity on the one hand, because I know more Christians, but is they maybe kind of hold it at arm's length. It can't really fit in very well, other than James Leininger's dad, Bruce, ironically, who's a Christian, and said that he initially struggled, and it kind of, because it went against his religion, and in the end he's kind of managed to find a way that they can coexist, and he can kind of now allow it to be part of his religion in a way. But I think that maybe from at least my point of view, where I haven't done much research, is quite rare. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that? Are there religions that just reject it, and do they have a way of trying to explain it, or do they just reject the evidence for it totally?
Um, yeah, I don't know really. I think probably the religion that would be most likely to reject it would be Christianity. Um, there are certain branches of Islam that would be more open to it, and there's the Druze communities, and but yeah, I think for the most part, it's hard to say because if we don't have an example of a case from a particular society that doesn't believe in reincarnation, it's unlikely they're going to report them to begin with.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know of any cases where there is, or as far as the historical material goes and the cross-cultural stuff, where there was a reincarnation case and it was met with, hostility and disbelief. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Just one thing that I just kind of popped back into my head it's kind of more related to NDEs. So OBEs, out of body experiences, particularly veridical out of body experiences, like where people see things, like, that happens these days more and more increasingly, where people would see some things or hear some things that then they come out of their NDE and they talk to their doctor about it or whatever, and like, oh yeah, okay, that actually happened. Okay.
Right.
Is that something you came across frequently? I mean, you've mentioned one or two earlier, but like, was that frequent? Again, I know it would have been way harder for them to record this and to to get all this recorded in a way that you're going to be able to then research it and find it. But yeah, did you come across many of them, many veridical out OBEs, out body experiences?
Yeah, there are quite a few. I mean, I would say a lot of them, just the fact of describing the OBE in detail was kind of the thing that was meant to be veridical. Like, I saw my body on the battlefield and saw my parents at my funeral. But as far as it being independently verified by somebody who is alive, that would be much rarer, I think. Yeah, there aren't many of those I can think of. And I think, again,
the
it's
further
just
you go back, the harder it is.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it's just the context in which these things were reported. So if it's in a religious text, they've got an agenda and they've got particular things they want to tell you. Or if it's in reported by a missionary, then a missionary might not want to express that because it might contradict something in Christianity or whatever. So yeah, the context is a big issue with a lot of these texts, and always has to kind of be taken into account. What are the agendas of the person who wrote it, and to what degree can we even understand it, if it's a translation or if it's a culture we're not too familiar with or whatever. So.
Yeah, that's very true. Like, I always think about that in terms of these old books that religions are based on. Like, I use the Bible as the example.
Yeah.
It was written by humans, right? It was written by human beings, and we're fallible, and we can kind of misinterpret things. And I often look at it that way and just think, how I find it hard to imagine how I'd be able to trust these people, because it's not even just about trusting Jesus or God or whatever. You have to trust the humans that have relayed these messages, and it's pretty hard to wrap my head around that.
Yeah, and people who believe in or claim to believe in the literal truth of the Bible, which is full of contradictions. So you have to believe in two different things at the same time. I mean, even within just the Gospels and the stories of what happened with Jesus, there's contradictions there and disparities in the facts.
Yeah.
So
I think most people that say that they take the Bible literally would kind of recant that once they'd say like, oh yeah, accept that bit or those bits, just just because there's some parts in there where I think it would send you to hell if you wear items of clothing that are made from more than two materials or something like that. If you mix materials in your clothes, then that's straight to hell. If you put more than one kind of animal in a pasture together, that's bad place. Talking of great books, which of your books would you say is the most profound in your opinion? Like which one would be the most important for if somebody only had time to read one? And they had to, and money was no option, so the £100 one is still in the mix.
Yeah.
If they get, which would you say is the one that you need to read that one?
That's a tough question. uh, um, Whenever I kind of revisit them, I think that, oh, this is the best one. In some
Yeah.
ways, I think the near-death experience in indigenous religions um, is because it's a very well, it's not a narrow focus because it looks at three world regions. It looks at the Pacific and
Mm.
Africa and North America. But at the same time, it's a fairly narrow question about, the way NDEs are interpreted in all these societies. So I think for probably most readers, the next world is probably the best because it's a broader overview of all of my work basically up until now, um, and it takes into account the mediumship stuff and the reincarnation stuff. And I think maybe the other thing that sets it apart is a kind of deeper dive into the question of like, if we accept that all these kinds of experiences are true and that people really are having these NDEs that are evidence or glimpses into another world, that the intermission memories are true, the mediumship stuff is true, then what kind of afterlife can we possibly
Mm.
glean from that? Like, what would even be possible given all these crazy differences, but then also the general similarities? So
Yeah.
yeah, I think just the way that book kind of takes all that stuff into account is probably you know maybe more interesting to a lot of people.
Yeah. But obviously read all three of them.
Yeah, yeah, for
And
sure.
I'll put the links to all three in the description. So another kind of question, maybe not about your main areas of research, but just to inquire as to whether you've come across this phenomena while you've been doing your research. So it would be psi phenomena,
Mm.
psychic abilities and things like that. In the modern day, it's pretty much been proven in the lab. I would say by Dean Radin, by the people from DOPS, and plenty of other amazing scientists. It kind of speaks for itself, whether people want to believe it or not. It's kind of there.
Yeah, and the dream
But
telepathy
has
stuff with Stan
with
Krippner
Stanley
and Leslie
Krippner,
Ullman. Yeah,
yeah, yeah, exactly. There's actually loads of it. I had no
yeah,
idea like 2 years ago before I kind of got into all this stuff. I had zero idea. Psychic would have just meant to me like very rudimentary form of telepathy and just like guessing things correctly and doing astrology or whatever. I would really have not have known where to begin with it.
yeah.
But is it something that you came across in your research? Is it something again that transcends time and cultures and things like that? And how did it appear? And yeah, I got loads of things coming to my mind about it.
Yeah, I think it's as far as it being like a shamanic thing, a shamanic practice of
Yeah.
divination but as far as telepathy from one mind to another, not really that I can think of. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I guess
I
because
mean, in any way, I'm getting at, so like anything, yeah, telepathy, precognition, remote viewing, or clairvoyance, or whatever,
yeah,
and just anything, yeah, kind of that some people would call paranormal. I like to think of it just as normal, but just that we don't understand yet. But
yeah,
any of these kind of aspects, yeah,
yeah. I think in the shamanic stuff, there's obviously
healing
there's
as well.
traveling to the other world and getting information from spirits of the dead there, getting some kind of advice. But there's also precognition and clairvoyance and things like that. Um, Also in the medieval European NDE examples, there's a few there, um,
Mm-hmm.
but I think in a very different way than in modern psi research. There's examples of these things occurring, but it's not kind of in any controlled way or specific way. It's almost like these are just other things that happen within these cultures,
Yeah.
and within the shamanic or healing traditions.
Mm. So like, what they might come back and say like, oh, I saw, like, X, Y, and Z, and it's just something that maybe means a lot to them, or some mountains or a temple. Or, I have no idea. I'm just kind of
Yeah,
guessing out
or,
loud
or
here.
there's Native American examples where they saw supposedly the European invaders before they even came.
Oh wow,
Yeah, and then
yeah,
also had visions of Jesus and things like that before Christianity was even introduced. Which
that's really interesting.
yeah,
Was that common, or was that
no, it was
just was
just a
it just
few
a couple of
yeah,
examples?
just a few
Yeah,
examples of things like that. And then in the
wow,
Chinese, ancient Chinese NDEs, this again the precognitive political events that were going to happen, that sort of thing. But yeah, they tend to be associated with either an NDE or some other kind of specific shamanic type of activity, I think. Not a lot of spontaneous things like that.
Yeah. What about like the relationship again through time and beliefs and stuff? I should just kind of have that as an asterisk for every question I ask you through time and beliefs and cultures. And again, I wasn't planning to ask you this as little as 10 seconds ago. It's just kind of popped into my head out of nowhere. But lucid dreaming, was that something, that was done? I can imagine, go back 100, 200 years, I can imagine even in, UK and America, that would have been seen as, in some cultures, as like evil or like, like bad stuff, like messing with the devil.
Yeah.
I don't know. But yeah, is that something that you've come across, like accounts of lucid dreams? Because again, there could be some integration there with NDEs and some similarities.
Yeah. I would say no, as far as the culture themselves are concerned. I've never, except in Buddhism, especially like Tibetan Buddhism, they have dream yoga, they call it, which is essentially lucid dreaming. But for the most part, I don't think there was like a category of lucid dreams, and I think they probably would have instead just saw it as a journey to another world.
Yeah.
They would have just believed that it was an actual experience. And there's a lot of examples of NDE type narratives that were dreams, and they'll classify them as dreams, and there was no dying and coming back to life context to it, but they still would see it as like a vision of the other world, or traveling to the other world.
And it would still, I guess, for them to write about it in that context would have had to have been different to a normal dream.
Yeah.
Because that's what people would say now. And I mean, it seems like it's possible to have, spiritually transformative experiences, or these profound experiences in a dream, or in sometimes just in waking state or whatever. But it seems different to dreams. People describe that as like so realistic and so vivid compared to every other dream they've had in their life.
Yeah. And there's there was I think 1950s, Irving Hollowell was an anthropologist of Native Americans. And he found that obviously he didn't know the term near-death experience, but he isolated it as a different type of experience. And he found that Native American cultures he was studying almost always made a distinction between dreams, important dreams, like significant, I guess, shamanic type dreams, and near-death experiences. Yeah. And that was like the hierarchy of value that they gave them. So NDEs were on top, I guess, because they were spontaneous. And because they left the body and everything. And then these kind of more powerful shamanic visionary dreams were in the middle, and then regular dreams were at the bottom, as far as their value and what they could teach you, and interactions with the other world and things like that.
Yeah.
Which is pretty interesting, that because one of the kind of ethnocentric arguments that people would have is, well, they were just primitive people, they didn't know what they were believing, but they had this system of these are the more evidential experiences, and therefore we can believe in them more.
Yeah, they're primitive people. They believe anything, tell them anything in a dream, they'll believe it. I think people weren't as different to us on an individual level, right? Like, because again, obviously in terms of our culture and our society, like we're way more advanced as far as we know than any culture that ever lived on Earth, or any period of time that ever lived on Earth. However, individually, maybe we weren't that different, to nowadays to people back then.
I think that's
like, I know if I was isolated as just myself, there's no way I'd be able to do any, technologically speaking, I'd be lost. It'd be back to the dark ages. Like I'd be lucky to be able to have fire and stuff, and like make a semi-decent shelter. I'd consider myself doing well if I managed to do that. So it's just an interesting little side thought.
Well, and I think that's shown just traveling. If you travel to somewhere where they're not used to seeing a lot of Westerners and they don't speak English or whatever, but you can still share a joke with somebody, or you can still make eye contact about, oh, look at that poor sad dog, or whatever. There's still this like cross-cultural communication that happens that shows we have some basic similarities.
Some shared humanity. That kind of unspoken bond. As well, just another totally random question that's just flown into my mind as we keep saying the word NDEs, near-death experiences. Do you think we're going to have to like change somehow the terminology, either with regards to near-death experiences as we've been discussing them, or in regards to you know, because again, I'm already struggling with the terminology, but people that aren't aware of this kind of NDE, they'll say near-death experience as in like, oh, I was about to cross the road in a car, like I so nearly got hit.
Yeah.
I had this crazy near-death experience, but they're not talking about anything spiritual or anything, probably not even a, you know, life flashing before my eyes, just simply I was very close to getting hit by a car and dying, or I was very close to falling off a cliff, but there was no, you know, do you see what I mean? Like it's very common to hear near-death experience used in said exactly the same way in these two different how are we going to get past that? Are we going to have to come up with different terminology for the more mundane near-death experience where you just nearly die? Because I do think that kind of less spiritual NDE, the one where you're not actually physically dying, the one where you nearly die, that one probably does have some profound effects on people as well, I would imagine. Like if you studied them after the experience, I would imagine lots of people do change, and because they've been closer to death in that way. But yeah, how are we going to deal with this? Because I think as NDEs become more a part of the public consciousness, part of the mass, you know, awareness, we're going to have some issue there.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think, I mean, the kind you were talking, the fear death experiences, I think that's a pretty good terminology.
It's not bad. Yeah.
I mean, it's a little silly, but it also is, you know what it's referring to, you know. But yeah, you're right. And
maybe I'll go with that.
I've had people many times say to me, "Oh, you study near-death experience? I almost got hit by a bus," and I'm waiting for the experience narrative to come, and it never does. and I wrote a kind of tongue-in-cheek article about it on Medium a few years ago.
Oh yeah.
And I think I suggested to call it an "I almost died" experience or something like that.
I was gonna call it an almost death experience, or an I almost died. I see, that's I almost died experience. Yeah, we'll have to do something because as it becomes more and more aware, like more and more talked about, it's going to become very confusing.
Yeah, but I think ones where, there should be a sort of hierarchy of them, and I think ones that are, objectively happened when a person had a temporary clinical death, they should maybe be called temporary death experiences. The ones that I researched, there's no way to determine that. And we're just kind of, accepting whatever the culture thought was death, which is probably usually death. People can kind of tell the difference between a live person and a dead person. But maybe there needs to be something that parses even those two kinds of experiences. But
it's true.
Yeah, the kind where there is no actual, leaving of the body and nothing happened other than that I got scared because, something almost killed me. That's a completely different thing. And the media uses it all the time too. There was a few months ago, some Kardashian had a near-death experience because she fell off a boat, and that was it. I think she even almost fell off the boat.
I always hear it on TV, on YouTube, whatever, in films and TV show or in interviews. People will mention it and my ears prick up and they're like, oh yeah, but I stepped back onto the pavement and then I went and got a subway, and I'm like, oh okay, so it's not what that's not what I was trying to listen for. But I've heard people mention that they could, actual death experiences, but as you say, they wouldn't all fit into that. Temporary death experience could work. Maybe reversible death or non-permanent death experience. I don't know. Or maybe we'll have to think of, like you say, like a fear death experience, or an I almost died experience, or a close to death moment, or I don't know, something.
Or if we don't know if they were genuinely clinically dead, like an apparent temporary death experience or something like that.
But
if it were taken more seriously as a science and as a phenomenon, then we probably would have all those distinctions. We probably would have sorted out. But, there's still such a stigma about it.
Hopefully soon, because I do feel like it's shedding that stigma. Slowly but surely. I'm quite new to this compared to you and all the people I speak to, but that people seem to agree with me that slowly it does seem to be changing. Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, even just the fact that scientists, as I mentioned earlier, like this thing that, this explains a near-death experience, that there's a burst of activity in the brain. At least that's acknowledging that there's something that needs to be explained. Whereas, I mean, strangely enough, in religious studies, in the humanities, they won't even go that far. So, and because of, this is because of the fact, like, there's this distinction between religious studies and theology, and, never the twain shall meet, really. And there's this kind of almost chip on the shoulder in religious studies. They don't want to be seen as theological in any way, shape, or form. So if you suggest that there's a kind of experience that religious beliefs could be based on, therefore a religious experience, you can't talk about that because everything has to be culturally created from the perspective of religious studies. So, and I think that's a kind of interesting phenomenon that they're even further on the skeptic side than some materialist scientists when they're supposed to just be humanities religious studies scholars, and it's actually quite ethnocentric because it's denying the voices of the people who tell us about their religions and their beliefs and experiences.
Yeah. On the brainwaves thing, where they did that where they found that recently, there would be so many ways, right, that we could speculatively explain that away. Like potentially, so many things that you could say, maybe it was this or maybe it was that. And that's all they've done is to say, maybe that's where a life review or a near-death experience happens. I could just as easily say, maybe that's where, like when your iPhone syncs to your computer, there's like updating, and maybe that's the final, or backing up, a backup to make sure it's like saved everything in the cloud.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the final backup that our consciousness does from our brain to make sure, okay, I've got everything that was in the temporary brain. Yeah, doing my final backup, and then poof, we're out of here. Yeah. Maybe that's what it is. Maybe that's the final bit of activity.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Going back to your research, tell me a bit about the research you've done into mediumship. I'm particularly fascinated by that phenomenon.
Yeah, that I approached a similar way to how I approached the intermission memories and the children who remember past lives. I kind of again used the NDE as the comparative basis, and I went back and looked at descriptions of the afterlife in mediumship accounts from mostly 19th and early 20th centuries. And that's because they seem to have, be considered to have some of the best evidence, stuff researched by the Society for Psychical Research, and mediums like Leonora Piper and Geraldine Cummings and people like that. And what's interesting about that is it's very, very culturally situated, the descriptions of the afterlife. I should say also what's kind of puzzling about the whole thing is the descriptions of the afterlife don't seem to come from mediumship sessions where they get evidential material. So they seem to come from other sessions. So that's like the first kind of methodological problem right there. So I had to rely on mediums who were considered to be the best mediums rather than sittings that were the best sittings. So
got you.
But still, you would think that if the information that these mediums were getting across was accurate, then why wouldn't their descriptions of the afterlife also be accurate? So that's kind of the way I proceeded. And it was interesting because, these are all taking place in Victorian or Edwardian England or America, and very much within that culture. So the afterlife was described as basically a kind of idealized, rarefied version of middle-class England at the time. And there's one example where it wasn't just one middle-class, rarefied, idealized England. It was a series of 7 all stacked on top of each other, and each one is a kind of higher version of the other one. And people live in, quaint little thatched cottages. And but then there's a kind of insidiousness that starts to creep in a little bit with people still have their servants in these cottages because servants aren't spiritually advanced enough to even desire emancipation. All they want to do is serve their masters. And that's also used in American contexts, going a bit further back for justifying slavery in the afterlife. And then there's examples of the higher up you go, the higher your skin color becomes, the lighter your skin color becomes. And all religions are equal. Some of them will say, there's kind of gestures towards, progressive enlightened thought, which was happening back then. But then they'll say things like, but in the end, everybody will come to Christ because, so there's a lot of, religious intolerance and classism and racism, which, of course, on one level you would expect because was the kind of consciousness of that historical moment, even among a lot of sort of enlightened progressive people. But the issue is not so much all that, which is unsurprising. The issue is if they're claiming that this is an objective afterlife, And this is just the way the system is, that, Japanese Buddhists will have their own little realm until they accept Jesus, then they can join the rest of us. Um, how are we to square that with near-death experience accounts and intermission memories accounts? So I think what was going on with that was, if we can accept that any of the mediumship descriptions of the afterlife were real, which, the verdict is out, I think, the way to understand it is just that it's a little bit of truth filtered not only through the communicating spirits' minds, but very much through the medium's minds, and with all the difficulties of communication that they have, because it's one of the things they always said in those reports, that they get kind of impressions of things rather than verbatim details. But then in other contexts, they'll claim to have gotten verbatim details, and then that's the evidence. So it's I find that sort of interesting, but I find it a lot less compelling than the reincarnation cases and the NDE cases. But so if we are to take them all seriously, and to accept that these are real descriptions of an afterlife coming through these mediums, then we just have to, I think, assign a different level of interference from the medium than we might from someone who's having an NDE.
If only there was a way to know, like, which ones were because if mediumship is real in any way, which I think the evidence kind of speaks for itself in terms of, I've read a lot of stuff and seen a lot of very, unbelievable accounts, really, of people that I trust that have sat with somebody that have been given information that just doesn't make any sense. They could have got it via any other means. But assuming it is, then you'd have to say at least one or some accounts of like you say, the afterlife would be real, and then it's just, if only we could know which ones. But that's like finding a needle in a haystack, I suppose.
And then it's also the cultural overlay on it is also kind of proceeds into more recent mediumship research. So like Gary Schwartz's mediums that he studied, when they describe the afterlife, there's no racism in it, and it's kind of free of all of those problematic elements. It's a universal loving God who's non-judgmental, and he's not really associated with any particular religion. So it very much follows the current thinking of the time as time progresses. Which is also it
is interesting.
It just makes me wonder if somebody who is a highly conservative, if there is such a person, a highly conservative evangelical type medium, if they really did have communication with the spirit, how would that come out? I guess.
That's interesting. That's an interesting thought. We should try and find one. or a racist medium or something. Try and find out, like, in their afterlife, like, I think segregated. Is it?
And if they're stating it as really... as that's just the way the afterlife is for everybody, rather than one person's experience of it.
That is fascinating. I mean, this is all fascinating stuff, really, isn't it? What was the earliest evidence, or like not evidence, but what was the earliest kind of accounts of mediumship that you came across?
I actually didn't go back any further than sort of mid-19th century. So because I was just really focusing on the,
Do you think it would have happened in some manner in like ancient cultures?
Yeah, for sure. Is
there any?
In fact, there's a Native American tradition called a tent shaking ceremony, where they would go into a tent and communicate with spirits in the other world. So yeah, it definitely happened. But there was unfortunately nobody around to kind of record in detail what communications they got, or if there was any veridical information that came through, or anything like that. It would have been
much harder than today to record that kind of thing.
It's
thankfully today we got like the Windbridge Institute and stuff like that doing like actual research into these phenomena, which is just so valuable.
And stuff will be coming, I think, from the Bigelow Institute. They've put out a call for different kinds of research projects that will go in that direction, I think.
I hope so. They did that contest, didn't they, last year? And I think they're doing something else this year, and hopefully that would be exciting. He's got the money for it, so I'd love to see him do more in that. Well, I don't know how much he already does behind the scenes, but I'd love to see more work done there. So taking in everything that you know and that you've researched, that you've read, that you've learned, that you've found out, in your opinion, what would you say is the strongest individual element for the survival that makes the case for the survival of consciousness? And I kind of specify individual element because obviously we all agree that the main case for survival would be the whole body of evidence. Mm-hmm. But if you had to pick kind of one aspect of it, what would you say is the strongest standalone?
I think NDEs are the best, followed by the cases of reincarnation type, followed by mediumship. Maybe there might be a little bit on a par. But as far as like the one element of NDEs, I'd probably say seeing people not known to have died, because veridical observations outside the body during OBEs, I don't necessarily agree with a lot of the attempts to explain them away, like in the Pam Reynolds case, for example, saying that some part of her faculties must have been working when the blood was drained from her head and her body temperature was lowered, but still.
And she had stuff in her ears and her eyes taped
exactly,
shut,
but
like
she must have heard or seen something. I mean, you can still go there with that if you really wanted to, but having seen somebody who you didn't know had died, and then coming back and then their death being confirmed, I just see no way of explaining that in any materialist logical means. I mean, maybe you could go for a super psi kind of explanation, but still that's a supernatural explanation. So
that's what I thought. I mean, if we found something that could be it's either that or that, whichever way, it's kind of paradigm changing. And in my mind, I don't think everybody would agree with me, but in my mind, and again, I think we have proven this now, but if just for why not, just to play it safe for now, but if we proved psychic abilities were real, then that would totally open the door to survival, and the other way around.
Right.
You see what, for me personally, because it's like, wow, if we can do stuff with our consciousness that seems to be remote or whatever, then that would make it way easier to comprehend the idea of survival after death.
And I do think that with the super psi or living agent hypothesis, that it's some of it has to get so convoluted and complex and stretching the bounds of of acceptance that it's actually even more difficult to believe that the person really was in communication with the dead or had an NDE or whatever. It's almost like it's the less parsimonious explanation, really.
Yeah, I would agree. Dean Radin is somebody that I think he's quite strong on the idea that he's not against. I don't think that survival could be a thing, but he says that he's not convinced that there's evidence that is untainted by the possibility of it being something to do with psi, the living agent psi thing. And that's next time I get him on my podcast, it's something I want to talk to him about in a little more detail. Like some of the harder to explain aspects, like you said, with like seeing people that they didn't know to have passed. I do still think veridical OBE, that doesn't work, but maybe drop in communications within mediumship where like they're doing a sitting with somebody and a random character comes through, and it's later turns out they can kind of prove that it was a real person and he had a motive to come through and things like that. I think that's pretty fascinating, pretty compelling.
And then like you said, the sort of cumulative evidence too. I know that's not a a replicable thing, cumulative evidence, but even in I think the least convincing category of evidence is the past life regression stuff, the supposedly hypnotic regression. I think there's very little evidence that came from that, but there still is occasionally something that's interesting about it. Or I just read today in The Guardian, there's this spontaneous foreign accent phenomenon where all of a sudden people just start speaking with an Irish accent consistently, and a woman spoke with a Jamaican accent consistently after having a stroke or some kind of brain injury or something. So that's again, I wouldn't look at that in isolation and think, oh, there's evidence for reincarnation, but in the context of all the other evidence, it becomes interesting. So.
Yeah, And when there's like after death communications, maybe somebody communicates through a dream to they say like, I need you to pass this message to somebody else or something along those lines, but they speak in a foreign language that the recipient doesn't understand. Right. And only when they pass the message to like, it's a language that they're like, oh, the only person I know in this language is this guy. And they pass the message on and he's like, oh yeah, it means this. And only then did they realize like what it was saying and everything like that. There's a few cases like that. But yeah, NDEs is definitely the thing where they see somebody that's passed is definitely very, very compelling. And I'll be interested to see what Dean has to say about that, among other things. So is the correlation, in your opinion, between the accounts of NDEs, mediumship, intermission memories, and these other kind of aspects that you've looked at, is it strong enough to point towards an afterlife? I mean, obviously it does point towards an afterlife. I'll save you the trouble of saying that, but is it strong enough to give you the confidence to say like that, maybe at least in speculative terms? I'm not asking you to go on the record as an academic or a scientist, but do you personally think that there is probably an afterlife? Like, where do you stand on it? Again,
I think these experiences and the evidence gives people a reasonable reason to believe in them, to believe that there's an afterlife. I think there's definitely a reasonable case for afterlife beliefs, more so than pretty much any other aspect of religions, and I think you could be an atheist and still believe in an afterlife. I don't think there's any difficulty there. And again, I wouldn't say that about nothing that comes to the top of my head anyway. Very many things about religious beliefs in general. There's probably more of a rational reason to believe in an afterlife than a lot of other things. And that's including existence of God, because I don't think the being of light in an NDE is necessarily a god or any kind of non-human entity. It could be an ancestor spirit or whatever. So yeah, I think it's reasonable, but I also think that most people need to expand their acceptance of what the afterlife might be like, and kind of refrain from interpreting it through either their own religion or even their own experience. I think it can also be different for everybody. And this goes back to what we were saying earlier. There's the idea where people say, well, NDEs don't occur cross-culturally, which obviously is not true. But then they often say another argument against NDEs being evidence for an afterlife is that they're not the same across cultures. So just what we were saying earlier, people experience things in this life in different ways. Why would they experience things in the next world in the same way? So I think it's perfectly possible, if not plausible, that some of us are going to encounter Jesus or Krishna or the Buddha or whoever. Some will just encounter a being of light. Some of us will reincarnate. Some of us won't. And I think some of the things that we experience in the other world will be probably objective, and some of them will be created by our psychology and be in a sense hallucinatory, and some will be in a combination of both. So it's we're overlaying the afterlife reality with the kind of cultural symbols that we have that we use to make sense of the world. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. It does. I'll ask you a little bit more about what it might be like in a second, but I'll try one last time. But your gut feeling, but just totally like nobody's going to quote you on it. Just your personal. Do you lean one way or another? Like a little bit more? Are you slightly more like I think the evidence says that there probably is, or are you kind of totally on the fence, or do you just not want to reveal?
It's funny because when I start getting off the fence in one direction, I get sort of pulled back to the middle. But the direction I start getting pulled off towards is more that it's legitimate, that there's really is an afterlife. So, and that might be because Jesse Bering is a cognitive scientist, and he did experiments with children and realized that basically belief in an afterlife is hardwired into our brains. And he's a total skeptic. He doesn't think that there's anything to NDEs or anything. But I thought that was a really interesting discovery, because it means that we're kind of cognitively predisposed to believe in an afterlife and to accept things like NDEs and mediumships and be compelled by them and interpret them in terms of what we want to believe. So
Yeah.
So I'm also conscious of that dynamic, that that there's that part of my brain that is hardwired to want to believe these things. So, but I do just try to stay on the fence as much as possible. Um, Probably as far as I would go would be like to think that when I die, those last few moments are going to be what near-death experiencers report, and I'm going to believe that it's an actual experience of surviving my own death. Maybe it even is for a few minutes, but after that, who knows? Because all we know from NDEs is that this finite experience happens, but we don't know what's going to happen if they didn't come back.
Unless the intermission memories are all, or not all true, but unless some of them are true.
Yeah, or the mediumship stuff. So
yeah, and or exactly. Yeah, it is fascinating. Thank you for sharing your gut feeling, because
I know I waffled around
I know
too.
that no, it's a hard one sometimes to, especially to put it out there, whether it's to yourself or to anybody listening. But it like you were saying, that person says that we're hardwired to believe in these things, and even aside from that, it's easy to see that it's comforting, right?
Yeah.
To believe that there's something after we die, because again, I'll speak for myself and say that I was terrified of death for most of my life, like totally terrified by the concept of it, by losing anybody I loved or by myself passing. It was like totally freaky. Like it's like it takes the fear of the unknown, which I kind of have a little bit anyway, like in terms of getting sedated for a medical procedure or something like that. That freaks me out. So then death is like that, like the biggest, it's the big thing, isn't it? It's the big one, and that's always terrified me. Learning about it, I mean, again, I grew up in a kind of maybe a Christian household and maybe believed that as a child, I think, and then kind of grew out of that, or allowed myself to realize I'd grown out of that at a certain point. And then I suppose I had a few years or a couple of years like semi-rudderless almost, or a few years of just kind of not really thinking about these things, and just kind of trying to dismiss the idea of death, just trying to not think about it. And thankfully the universe played ball a little bit and didn't force me to think of it too much for a couple of years. But then Leslie's book Surviving Death and other things, but researching that with just a purely open mind, no like pre-held belief, I didn't need to believe that we lived, something happened afterwards when I started that, but the evidence kind of spoke to me. And again, if I'd gone straight to a chapter about mediumship, I wasn't at a place in my life where I was ready for it. Like if mediumship had been the first chapter, I have no clue if I'd have got through the book or not. Maybe I'd be like, it would just be another book that I started and like never got through. But the fact that it was kind of stairs, like easing you in with NDEs and then maybe some past life memories, and then it really changed my view of everything. And then since then I've just been doing deeper research, and all the stuff you've researched just kind of solidifies it, in my opinion, and makes it even stronger, case. But back to talking about what the afterlife might be like, I've heard you somewhere else talk about potential similarities with lucid dreaming, like a collective lucid dream, or maybe like a kind of collective lucid dream, but at the same time we're all having our own individual lucid dream. I'm not sure exactly how you envisage it, but I'd love to hear about that. And also what your thoughts are, and if you, again, based on your research, whether you think there might be some kind of choice, whether any of these cultures or beliefs have had whether they've thought that there'd be an element of choice, because that's something I've kind of like to hold on to. I used to think, like, for a while I've been thinking, with all these different aspects, like, I like to think that we'd have a choice. Maybe we don't, maybe we're forced a certain direction. But when I spoke to Jeffrey Mishlove recently, he actually said from the research he's done, he thinks that the evidence suggests that there is a level of choice, which made me feel good. But what is your take on all that, on what the afterlife would be like, how you would best describe it? Because I loved your kind of similarities you drew with lucid dreaming, and whether you think there's any choice. Just waffle on all that for me for a bit.
Okay. I would say lucid dream in the sense that, I mean, obviously lucid dreams are probably not actually an experience of another world. It's, it's something going on in our confined to our consciousness. which is sleeping in a bed, in a physical body. Um,
Yeah.
so so I think that the lucid dream analogy is interesting in the sense that when you're having a lucid dream, usually you're having a dream and then you become lucid in it. And so you're conscious you're dreaming, and maybe there's certain elements of the dream that you can change or modify, um, or look at in a different way or whatever. But the general background of the dream, the location, if it's a city street or a country lane or whatever, that's going to kind of retain its stability within you becoming lucid. It's not like suddenly you're master of the universe and Doctor Strange creating all these different worlds. Um,
Yeah.
so to me, that's kind of a useful analogy of what I would envision an afterlife to be like. That you would be awake in this disembodied, pure consciousness sort of state, um, but you're kind of interacting with the consciousnesses of other people at the same time, and maybe you're if possibly co-creating the environment, but I tend to think it's more like as we talked about with an NDE, you're projecting your own symbolic culture system of symbolism and your own personal system of symbolism onto like objective elements. So again, the being of light being the most obvious example, but even things like if there's a spirit village, if we want to use that kind of terminology, that maybe the Native American NDE I mentioned earlier, Bianchi, that he sees teepees. Maybe I would see the exact same village as a series of southwestern pueblos, since I'm in Santa Fe at the moment, or somebody else might see it as a row of brownstone buildings in Brooklyn or whatever.
I'll see it as the Shire from from Lord of the
Right, yeah.
Rings.
But we're all seeing the same thing. So and maybe we can share our perceptions of them if we want to. But I think we're kind of just clothing the experience with our own psyche, basically.
Yeah.
So and that corresponds to Mahayana Buddhism. They kind of see the afterlife in similar terms. And there was a Oxford philosopher H.H. Price from the 50s, who he actually wrote this article for the Society for Psychical Research, either proceedings or journal, I can't remember. But he outlines, he doesn't use the term lucid dream because I don't think it existed then, but he outlines something very much like this and very similar to Buddhism, which I think is pretty compelling. And the reason I think all that would be the most logical model is that it's the only thing I can conceive of that accounts for all the similarities and all the differences at the same time. It's the only thing that kind of would be able to integrate them all. And anybody who says, the afterlife has to be the same for everybody because I experienced it, or because it's philosophically coherent and what I'm saying isn't, I think there's like a just sort of burden of proof argument that really nobody knows for sure. And to accommodate everything, this is the kind of only model that works for me. Although I'm open to suggestions.
Yeah, no, I think it's a fascinating way of looking at it and thinking about it. I really do. And obviously, like you say, like if the afterlife was the same for everybody, well, we have zero evidence of that really, when like everything kind of contradicts it. And it is very hard to put all of these different aspects of this phenomenon into, make some sense out of it. It's really hard to do that, to try and like actually, and that way of looking at it kind of does it in a way that still doesn't make sense, but in that sense none of it does. And maybe our brain isn't able to really comprehend a lot of it. Maybe we're not meant to be able to, but
it also
I think it's a pretty good stab at it.
And I also like it because it respects everybody's experience and everybody's so the whatever African or Native American or Pacific Islander, their experience is just as legitimate as a medieval Buddhist monk or a modern Christian or Muslim or whatever. We don't have to judge anybody's experience in order to still believe that it's reasonable that there's an afterlife.
Yeah. What about the accounts of the geography of the post-mortem realm of the afterlife? Like maps of it. Is there any consistency to that, or is it all a bit kind of all over the
Yeah,
place?
it's very much culturally situated and
Mm.
produced. Egypt
Yeah.
is a great example, and their afterlife geography. You have the the winding way in the sky and the stars is basically the mirror image of the Nile. You've got all these
Mm.
kind of celestial counterparts to earthly features. So it's very much a cultural thing. And the same with,
Yeah.
I mentioned bureaucracy in the other world. The early Chinese NDEs are just filled with bureaucracy. Um, and then with modern past life regression stuff, you get these long, long details of um, people in Greek columned libraries and people in togas, and it's almost like this very um, paradise based on ancient Greece or Rome or something where everyone's learning and you have all these lessons to learn. And then some of them are more like I know it reads to me like it's a cruise ship or something, and you're like for retired people, and you're being encouraged to participate in all these activities that will better yourself, and some of that just sounds like a nightmare because you're being it's not freedom, it's just kind of you're now in this other restrictive sort of governed society, which to me that's
Yeah.
not.
The Good Place.
Yeah, yeah,
Have you
yeah,
seen that TV
exactly,
series on
something like
Netflix?
that. um,
Yeah. Um,
that stuff's kind of
that's
unconvincing
good.
to me, but who knows, if I'm not going to judge anybody's experience, maybe those experiences were just as real to them.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you earlier, but I guess I forgot. It's when when we were talking about NDEs and negative NDEs came up. I wanted to ask if that's I believe it to be quite a rare thing having people having a negative NDE, what they perceive as the devil or hell or demons or anything like that. But how rare is it? And in terms of conceptions of the afterlife, is evil always present in one shape, one form or another, or are there any kind of cultures, beliefs that totally exclude anything evil?
um, yeah, I think the Native Americans and some of the small scale societies, there's not, yeah, it's just such a not a binary afterlife of good and evil or threat of hell or
Yeah.
anything like that. Um, but yeah, I think it's true that there's not that many negative examples. Even cross culturally, I could probably count them on one hand that I found,
Yeah. Yeah.
especially in the indigenous societies. There are a few in medieval European examples and some Buddhist ones as well. But I think yeah, I think that there is a presence of good and evil in as far as the beliefs go. And as I mentioned earlier, this
Mm.
kind of manipulation of those ideas in society to kind of control people's behavior. But it
Yeah.
might be that
Yeah.
even the negative um, uh, types of experiences were maybe based on negative NDEs. I think that's probably more speculative though, especially um, because of the way they expand and are used over time in that
Mm.
controlling sort of elite way.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, okay, before we move on past NDEs, and I just have a couple of questions left for you about a slightly different topic, but is there anything else you wanted to say on the subject of NDEs before we move forward? Anything that we haven't covered or anything specifically that jumps out to you as like, oh, I should mention this or that?
Um,
Doesn't have to
yeah,
be.
I really don't think so. Not off the top of my head.
No.
Yeah,
Well, hopefully that means we've covered quite a lot
yeah,
then.
I think we have.
Um, So I'm expecting this will be a no, but I want to ask you anyway. And it's in your research and your work. Have you come across any kind of historic UFO sightings or information regarding that? Yeah,
um, no, I haven't. I know there have been. I don't have the titles or authors to the top of my head, but I know there have been a couple of books that have explored, UFO type phenomena across cultures and in the ancient world and things like that, that are legitimate.
yeah. In fact, one is Jacques Vallée. I think I have it there. Wonders in the Sky.
Right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
by Jacques Vallée and Chris Orbeck.
yeah.
Um,
But no, I can't think of
you didn't.
any examples. And I think that if um, in a lot of these societies, they probably wouldn't have been considered UFOs or alien
Mm.
people. It would have been seen as some kind of spirit deity or something.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so on that note, then, do you think that there could be any kind of interrelation or any links or overlap? And again, I know we're well into speculation territory here, but why not? Do you think there could be any links, overlap, relation between the UFO phenomenon or UAP and religion and or NDEs and or consciousness or any of these elements?
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, that's probably the area of this stuff that I've looked into the least. But I know there's all these things in the Old Testament, for example, about this bizarre visions of the wheel of Ezekiel and all this stuff that have been interpreted
Mm.
as UFO. Um,
Flying chariots and
yeah,
stuff.
yeah. I mean, I'm pretty skeptical about that just because um, I feel like anytime you start delving into the cultural reasons for those things to have appeared in those texts, you're probably going to find them. Um, but maybe not. Who knows? Actually, that's something about NDEs that I should mention that's interesting. Thinking about the biblical stuff is that how in Christianity, it's the whole religion is sort of based on the death and resurrection of one man, but there are
Mm-hmm.
no NDEs in the Bible. So I always thought that was a pretty interesting thing, and that just shows the
Yeah.
kind of, I think, the cultural um, manipulation, and maybe that because Christianity is based on reaching heaven and reaching God through Jesus, they don't want people to know that you can also reach it just if you're going to die anyway. So that it's a thing that can
Yeah.
happen with a near-death experience or shamanism or whatever. Um,
Yeah.
but
It's the most famous NDE that we never heard about.
yeah, yeah. Although there is an apocryphal text called "The Harrowing of Hell" that describes his journey to hell and freeing the souls and all that.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
But yeah, as far as the UFOs, UAPs go, there's probably some. I think they're probably more related to sleep paralysis type phenomena than they are
Mm-hmm.
to NDEs. Um, I know that there's people have made some parallels between them, and also with um, drug experiences like with DMT or ayahuasca or whatever, and maybe they are all in the same kind of continuum as far as like what your consciousness does when it gets compromised by weird events. um,
Mm-hmm.
but I would hesitate to kind of call them the same type of experience just um, because of the context of the near-death experience being such an objective thing of being physically temporarily dead or near death.
Yeah. Interesting. I guess the last question I have for you today, after many questions, would be: have you had any first-hand experiences yourself with any of these phenomena? Whether you've seen a UFO, a light in the sky, or whether you have had any of these, like an NDE, or um, have you ever sat with a medium? I don't know, any experience at all that we've kind of touched on.
um, I did have a sleep paralysis experience actually, and I mean, sleep paralysis is interesting. You probably know the work of David Hufford. He kind of isolated them in the way that Moody isolated NDEs, and he found that they occur cross culturally, but they're interpreted in very culturally specific ways. So one person, and I guess I'll describe the phenomenon. It's basically when you're either just falling asleep or just waking up. It usually tends to happen in this hypnagogic state, they call it, and you feel like there's a pressure on your chest, like somebody's holding you
Mm.
down. You have the sensation that there's somebody in the room, like a very real, convincing idea that there's somebody there. Um, and it's a dream. It's a dream state, but it's usually happens in the place you actually are. So your mind is modeling the actual reality of where you're sleeping, and that contributes to the realism of it. So when I had it, I knew for some reason I knew that it wasn't real. I didn't believe it was a real experience, even though I was paralyzed and I couldn't wake up and I was trying to scream and I couldn't. Eventually, just kind of forced myself awake. Um, and to me, it was I lived in San Francisco at the time in the Tenderloin, which is a quite dodgy neighborhood, and so this was a sort of um, dodgy individual who was holding me down and but in another culture it will be an old hag in Newfoundland or in Japan it's a certain
Yeah.
type of ghost, and and that sort of thing. So yeah, I had that experience. I've had a couple of just kind of silly apparent psychic experiences. Like like I had a dream of an interaction with the woman who played uh, I can't remember her name in the movie or in real life, but she was an actress who was in The Creature from the Black Lagoon, the original 1950s one. Um, and I
Right.
had a dream about her kind of hovering in the darkness in front of me and trying to communicate something. And then when I woke up that morning and was scrolling through the news, I saw that she had died that night, which is,
Oh,
I
really?
mean, such a pointless precognitive sort of dream to have had. But nevertheless, it happened. So
Yeah.
a couple of things like that. And I've had some interesting meditational experiences and some psychedelic experiences when I was younger, but none of them kind of, I don't know if just something about my character or what, but even when I was kind of in the throes of a psychedelic experience, part of me always thought that's just the drug. So I never
Mm.
completely was able to, I guess, let go into the experience into a way that um, made me lose touch with my physical reality or even my mental reality.
Yeah. Yeah. What about when you were meditating? Were you able to let go more?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of had not quite an out of body experience, but it almost feels like it's tugging on on the roof of the
Oh, really?
consciousness or something. Um,
Wow.
so, but yeah, just kind of feelings of transcendence, I guess I would put them. Um, but uh,
Yeah.
but again, nothing that totally convinced me that it's not some process of my consciousness um, that's being manipulated in some certain way.
Yeah. Because you're a skeptic, but you're a good skeptic. That's the right kind of skeptic to be, isn't it? It's to question
Yeah,
everything
I mean,
and
I guess
to,
I just feel like there are things that I know and things that I don't know. So I don't, there's, I guess
yeah.
that's another way of saying I actually don't believe in anything. I just kind of know things or don't know them. I don't even understand belief in a way. It's almost like if I don't know it, why? To me, belief is like it's trying to convince yourself to think something is true, even if you don't know that it's true.
Yeah. On that, Dean Radin said something to me recently when we spoke. He said, I think it was that I've got to a point in my either life or career, but I've got to a point where I know a little bit now. But the amount that's left to know is essentially infinite.
Right? Yeah.
And I thought that
Yeah.
was great. And it's like it's along the same lines of the more we learn about all this stuff, it's not like, oh, okay, we become more certain of everything. We just have more
Yeah.
questions.
Yeah.
Like the more you learn, the more you wonder and ponder, and the more other doors of questioning open.
Right. And I
Um,
think that's partly why I get so
before,
emphatic about um, the actual results of my research, like with the near-death experience in Indigenous Religions book, where I showed that cross-culturally people are basing afterlife beliefs on their near-death experiences, and I have all these examples. So that's something I can claim to know and to have confirmed. I won't say discovered because other people
yeah,
had kind of went in that direction before I did. Um, so when you have people, and that's when I get wound up when people are saying, well, there is no such thing as near-death experiences, or they don't happen across cultures. Um, it's, all that says is I haven't looked at the evidence. That's what they're saying.
yeah. If the idea of in my head, the idea of somebody saying to you in a conversation, "Oh, there's no cross cultural NDEs." It's just somebody walking into your
Yeah,
trap. You're just like, "Oh,
yeah,
okay, are we gonna do this? All right, okay." You have no idea who you're talking to. Like, yeah, because you're an impressive authority on this. You're pretty much like the authority in the world on NDEs through history and cultures and across beliefs and
oh,
everything. And
thanks.
and the work you do is so valuable on that. It's incredible. Obviously, by the fact that we still have plenty of people that think these things aren't real or they don't happen or they only happen here for us right
Yeah,
now and all that kind of thing. It is so valuable, and hopefully more and more people need to become aware of
yeah,
it. But I guess that's not up to them. That's up to everybody else to show them and to influence them to look into this
yeah,
stuff.
yeah. And it's also, it's standing on the shoulders of giants kind of thing. There's like people like James McLennan and Alan Kelly here, who started looking at the cross cultural stuff and especially the small scale society stuff, in the late '90s,
Yeah,
early 2000s. I was kind of heading in the same direction they were when I found their work. So which is to me interesting because it's independent validation of things people already had come up with. They're both sociologists, or David Hufford again with the just generally the experiential source hypothesis thing that people base their religions and their beliefs on these strange experiences. But it's putting it all together is kind of how I see my contribution. So.
Yeah, no, and it's valuable, and thank you for it. And obviously, like I said earlier, I put all the links to your books and everything else in the description. If there's anything else you want me to put there, send it to me, or feel free to mention it in a moment. I could have gone on for hours. Like we've already been like nearly 3 hours. I could probably go for another 3 hours easily. Like these topics are just so incredibly fascinating. And obviously with your research, it's so broad. But yeah, thank you so much for giving me all this time. You've been really generous with your time, Gregory, thanks. And thank you for talking with me, sharing your experience, your work, your actual experiences as well. It's been fun and fascinating.
It's been a really good conversation. Thanks.
I appreciate it. Before I let you go, is there any kind of last words, any message, any words of wisdom, anything you want to say at all to people that have been watching or listening?
I guess, thinking about what you were saying, how you kind of previous terror about the afterlife and things like that. I think there's plenty of reason to not have that based on, the cross-cultural evidence and based on my research in general, that even if we do snuff out after the first 5 minutes of an NDE or whatever, at that point it's irrelevant because we've had this kind of glorious last minute experience anyway, and we're not going to know any better. But I think even aside from that, that's the kind of worst case scenario. Best case scenario is that, there's nothing I think to be afraid of. And that's repeated not only in the NDEs and intermission memory accounts, pretty much all of the, experiential phenomena around the afterlife, around the world, and in the earliest texts before they got manipulated into trying to frighten people. So.
Yeah. Well, that's valuable information for people, and hopefully, it will allow people to sleep easier at night, because it did to me once I started looking into all this. Thank you again. Really appreciate it, and all the best.
Anytime, Ben. Thanks.
Thanks to Gregory Shushan for talking with me, and thank you for listening to our conversation. I hope you learned some new things along the way. Please see the description for links to Gregory's books, social media, and much more. If you want to continue unraveling the universe with us, please consider subscribing, and if you like our content, please contemplate contributing via Patreon. Thank you.